My mother looked me dead in the eye at the port of Miami and told me I was not invited on the luxury cruise I had just paid $100,000 for. She demanded I hand my VIP boarding pass to my sister's husband because they wanted a true family trip without my aggressive energy. I smiled, handed over the ticket, and watched them board the ship. What they did not know was that while they were sipping champagne on the upper deck, I was legally selling the very house they lived in. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to teach a harsh lesson to people who mistook your generosity for weakness. I am Camille, 35 years old, and the founder of a financial technology firm in Atlanta. The blazing Florida sun was beating down on my shoulders as I stood near the VIP luggage drop at the terminal, holding 4 premium boarding passes that cost $25,000 each. I had arranged this 2-week Caribbean voyage as an anniversary gift for my parents, Jerome and Yvette. I even paid for my younger sister Jasmine to come along, hoping this trip might finally bridge the gap that had existed between us since childhood. I was checking the reservation details on my phone when a text message banner dropped down from the top of my screen. It was from my mother. The message read, "You are not coming. Dad wants just family on this trip. Give your ticket to Trevor. Go home, Camille." I stopped breathing for a fraction of a second. I read the words again, my mind struggling to process the sheer audacity of the demand. Just family. I had funded this entire excursion. I had paid off the remaining balances on their credit cards so they could pack new resort wear. Yet standing 30 feet away from me, near a towering stack of designer luggage, they were huddled together waiting to completely erase me from the experience. I did not text back. I walked directly over to them, my heels clicking sharply against the concrete. My father Jerome saw me approaching first. He immediately straightened his posture, adjusting the collar of his linen shirt, wearing the same stern, authoritative expression he used to intimidate his congregation back home. "What is this about?" I asked, holding my phone up so the text message was clearly visible. Jerome did not even flinch. He looked at me with a cold, dismissive gaze that I had known my entire life. We discussed it on the flight down. He stated his deep baritone, leaving no room for argument. "Your energy is too corporate, Camille. It is too aggressive. We are trying to relax, and whenever you are around, you bring this intense masculine pressure that just ruins the family vibe. Trevor was able to get the time off work, so it makes sense for him to take your spot. He is Jasmine's husband after all." I looked at my younger sister. Jasmine was 29, blessed with the lighter skin and loose curls my mother had always worshipped. Growing up, Jasmine was the delicate princess who needed protecting, while my darker skin and natural hair meant I was treated like a workhorse, expected to be tough, unbothered, and infinitely providing. Jasmine avoided my eyes, hiding behind the broad shoulders of her white husband, Trevor. Trevor stepped forward with a smug, self-satisfied smirk plastered across his face. He reached out his fingers, brushing against mine as he literally plucked the VIP luxury lanyard right out of my hand. "Come on, Cam," he sneered, pulling the pass away. "Do not make this harder than it has to be. It is a family bonding thing. You understand." I looked at Trevor's hand, holding a ticket that cost more than his entire annual salary. My father had always placed Trevor on a pedestal, desperately parading his white son-in-law at the country club to score points with his wealthy associates. In my family's eyes, Trevor marrying Jasmine elevated their social standing, while my decision to stay single and build a software empire was viewed as a tragic failure of my womanhood. "I bought these tickets, Trevor," I said, my voice dangerously calm. "I paid for the flights. I funded the onboard accounts." Before Trevor could formulate a response, my mother shoved her way to the front. Yvette grabbed my forearm, her acrylic nails digging into my skin. "Do not make a scene like you did at Jasmine's wedding," she snapped, referencing the time I refused to pay an extra $20,000 for a floral upgrade they tried to blindside me with. "You are 35 and single, Camille. You do not understand family dynamics because you refuse to settle down. You think throwing money at us makes you the man of the house. Well, it does not. Just go back to Atlanta and play with your little computer apps. Let us enjoy our vacation." Her words were designed to cut deep, utilizing the exact toxic colorism and gender expectations that had plagued my upbringing. I was the black tax personified. They expected me to silently hand over my wealth to maintain their extravagant lifestyle, all while degrading the very ambition that generated that wealth in the first place. A little computer app. That was how my mother described a fintech platform that was currently processing millions of dollars in daily transactions. I looked at the four of them standing there: Jerome with his arrogant pride, Yvette with her bitter resentment, Jasmine playing the silent victim, and Trevor, an entitled parasite wearing a watch I had bought him for Christmas, literally holding the ticket I had purchased for myself. Any other day, any other year, I might have argued. I might have cried. I might have tried to explain how deeply this betrayal wounded me. But standing in the heavy Miami heat, listening to the blast of the cruise ship horn, something inside me completely snapped. The desperation for their approval evaporated, leaving behind a chilling, absolute clarity. "Have a wonderful trip," I said, my voice completely devoid of emotion. My mother looked slightly taken aback by my lack of resistance, but Trevor just chuckled, looping the lanyard around his neck. "Thanks for understanding, Cam," he said, turning his back on me to grab Jasmine's hand. I stood in the terminal and watched my family walk up the gangway toward the massive luxury liner. I watched them laugh with the boarding staff. I watched them disappear into the crowd of wealthy vacationers. I did not shed a single tear. I reached into my purse and pulled out my phone. I opened my banking portal and navigated to the authorized user section. With 3 quick taps, I canceled the primary credit cards linked to their onboard spending accounts. I canceled the backup cards they had in their wallets. I left them with absolutely zero access to my funds. Then I dialed the number for my corporate lawyer. He answered on the second ring. "Desmond," I said, walking out of the terminal toward the rideshare pickup zone. "Camille," he replied, sounding surprised. "I thought you were boarding a ship right now. Are you settling in?" "There has been a change of plans," I stated, opening the door to a waiting car. "I need you to pull up the master file for Aegis Holdings. Activate the LLC clause on the Oakwood Drive property. We are liquidating it today. Find me a cash buyer immediately." There was a heavy pause on the other end of the line as Desmond processed the magnitude of what I was ordering. "Camille." He finally said, his tone shifting into complete professional focus. "You do realize that Oakwood Drive is the estate your parents currently live in?" "I know exactly what it is, Desmond," I replied, watching the cruise ship in the distance as my car pulled away from the port. "Sell it before they get back." I navigated the Atlanta traffic with the kind of focus that only comes after the world falls apart. The anger I felt at the cruise terminal had cooled into something far more dangerous. It was no longer a hot flame that consumed me, but a cold, precise blade. By the time I pulled into the parking garage of my office building, I had already finalized the mental landscape of my revenge. My parents had made their choice. They wanted their golden daughter and her white husband, Trevor, to have the luxury life I provided. They wanted me gone. Fine. I would give them exactly what they asked for. I stepped into the elevator, my head held high, and ascended to the war room. Desmond, my lead attorney, and Tara, the most cutthroat realtor in Georgia, were already waiting. They looked up as I entered, both sensing the shift in my posture. I did not waste time with pleasantries. I dropped my bag on the mahogany table and sat down, my eyes fixed on the manila folder sitting between them. "Let us get to work," I said, my voice steady. "I want that house sold by the time they get back from their cruise." Desmond looked at me, a flicker of concern crossing his face. "Camille, we are talking about a $500,000 asset. Even with a corporate cash buyer, you are looking at a 10% loss to expedite the sale. Are you sure you want to pull the trigger on this right now?" "I am sure," I replied, my gaze not wavering. "The money is not the point anymore. The point is the eviction. I want them to step off that ship and realize their daughter, the one they dismissed as aggressive and unwanted, is the reason they have nowhere to sleep." Tara flipped open her laptop, her expression shifting from professional to impressed. "I have a buyer ready to sign for an all-cash offer. They are a real estate investment firm that flips luxury properties. They don't care about the market fluctuations. They just want the deed. But you have to understand, to get them to sign today, we have to bypass every standard staging and inspection period. It is a fire sale. I opened the manila folder and pulled out A_6. This is the original deed I purchased 3 years ago. I did not put it in my parents' names because I knew how they would treat it, and frankly, I knew they would try to leverage it for loans I never approved. I then pulled B_6 from the folder. This was the lease agreement I drafted back then. It was a simple document, yet it held all the power. I remember the day I asked Jerome to sign it. He had thrown a tantrum in my living room, accusing me of trying to play landlord to my own father. He told me it was a slap in the face for a black man to pay rent to his own daughter. That ego, that refusal to be treated like an adult in a business arrangement, is exactly what kept the deed in my name and kept them as month-to-month tenants. Desmond nodded, pointing to the specific clause in C_6. He leaned in, his voice dropping. That ego is the reason this eviction is legal. You have a liquidation clause in your LLC charter that allows for immediate possession if you decide to sell or repurpose the property. Since they never signed a formal long-term lease, they have no protections against this quick sale. They are essentially guests who have overstayed their welcome. I stared at the documents, the ink on the page a stark reminder of their pride. They wanted to hold on to the image of being the heads of the family, yet they lived in a house I owned. They paraded their white son-in-law around as the protector of the family, while Camille, the one who worked 80 hours a week to fund their lifestyle, was treated like a nuisance. I was finished with the charade. I picked up the pen, the weight of it feeling lighter than any decision I had ever made in my life. I signed the sale order for the house. It was done. The house was sold, the ownership transferred, and the legal notices of eviction were already being prepped by Desmond's paralegals. We were cutting the cord. I looked up at Tara. How fast can you get the new owners to lock them out? Tara didn't even blink. Once the funds hit your corporate account, I can have the security team go over there and change the locks within the hour. They will be met with a notice of trespassing the moment they try to walk through the front door. A strange, hollow feeling washed over me. This was the house I had picked out for them. I had chosen the neighborhood because it was quiet. I had picked out the granite countertops and the master bath suite because I wanted them to have a retirement that was dignified and comfortable. But they had turned that home into a theater for their disappointment in me. Every dinner, there was a contest. Every visit was an evaluation of my worth, based on their narrow, outdated standards. The house wasn't a gift anymore. It was a tether, a way for them to keep me under their thumb, dependent on their approval and burdened by their expectations. Suddenly, my phone buzzed against the table. I looked down, expecting another text from Yvette or Jasmine. Instead, it was an incoming FaceTime call. I tapped the green button, and the screen exploded with color. It was Yvette, and she was not on the cruise ship deck. She was in what looked like a crowded, noisy, neon-lit hallway. She was frantic, her mascara running, and behind her I could see Jerome and a very disheveled Trevor. "Camille, pick up the phone right now," Yvette screamed, her voice vibrating through the speaker. "We are at the casino bar, and your stupid cards are not working. We tried to get drinks, we tried to pay for our dinner, and the waiter told us the card was declined. Do you have any idea how embarrassing this is? People are watching us." I watched them for a moment. They looked small. They looked frantic. They looked exactly like people who had just realized their entire reality was an illusion, one I had been projecting for them all along. I felt the calm spread through my chest, warm and certain. "I am not going to fix it," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "What did you say?" Yvette shrieked, her voice cracking. "You fix it right now! We are on vacation. We are supposed to be having the time of our lives. You are the reason this trip is happening, so get on the phone with your bank and make it work." "I am not your bank anymore," I replied. "I am not anything to you anymore. You wanted a family trip. You have the family you wanted. Enjoy the cruise." I hung up. I did not wait for her to shout back. I did not wait for Jerome to threaten me with his disappointment. I just tapped the screen, ending the call, and tossed the phone onto the table. Desmond was looking at me, his mouth set in a thin line. "You know they are going to come for you the second they get back. They are going to scream about financial abuse, about how you abandoned your parents. Let them scream, I said, standing up and grabbing my bag. They have been screaming at me for 35 years, Desmond. It is time they started screaming at their own reflection. I walked out of the office and into the cool air of the afternoon. The sky was a brilliant, cloudless blue, and for the first time in years, the city of Atlanta didn't feel like a place where I was performing. It felt like my own. I had stripped away the obligation. I had cut the wires that connected my bank account to their entitlement. I had sold the roof they lived under because they didn't deserve the shelter I had provided. I got into my car and sat for a moment. I thought about the cruise ship in the middle of the ocean. I pictured them realizing the full scope of their predicament. I pictured Trevor, the man who thought he was the family savior, trying to explain to the cruise line why he couldn't pay the bill. I pictured my parents suddenly stripped of their wealthy daughter's backing, having to face the reality of their finances for the first time in 3 years. It was a delicious, sharp image that made me realize I hadn't made a mistake. I had made a correction. My phone buzzed again. This time it was an email notification from the bank. The wire transfer from the corporate cash buyer had cleared. The funds were sitting there, millions of dollars, mine and mine alone, liberated from the mortgage of a house I was tired of paying for. I put the car in drive. There was no going back to the way things were. There was no more playing the role of the successful but disappointing daughter. There was only Camille, the woman who had built everything, the woman who was now finally debt-free and parent-free. I drove toward the city, turning up the music and let the windows down. The wind rushed past me, smelling of change, smelling of absolute and total freedom. They wanted me to go home. So I did. I went home to myself. I had barely stepped out of the private elevator and into the sleek, glass-enclosed reception area of my Atlanta headquarters when my phone erupted again. The screen lit up with a relentless barrage of notifications. 10 missed calls from my mother, 15 text messages from my sister, and now another incoming video call. They were not going to let this go. I walked past the brushed steel logo of Aegis Holdings, my financial technology firm, and pushed open the heavy oak door to my private office. I sat down in my ergonomic leather chair, placed the phone flat on the polished mahogany desk, and tapped the green accept button. I wanted to see the exact moment reality set in for them. The connection established, revealing the opulent gold-plated interior of the cruise ship casino. The background was a blur of flashing slot machines, crystal chandeliers, and wealthy patrons in formal evening wear. But the focal point of the screen was my mother. Yvette was practically vibrating with rage, her perfectly styled hair catching the neon lights of the casino floor. Behind her, I could see the tuxedo-clad bartender standing with his arms crossed, looking utterly unamused. Next to him stood Trevor, my sister's husband. His face flushed a deep, humiliating shade of crimson as he stared at his wallet. "Camille, this is not a game," my mother hissed into the camera, trying to keep her voice down to preserve whatever shred of country club dignity she thought she still possessed. "Call your bank right now." The bartender just declined Trevor's black card in front of the vice president of Sterling Solutions. "Do you have any idea how embarrassing this is? People are watching us. You need to fix this immediately." I leaned back in my chair, interlacing my fingers. I looked at her panicked expression, completely devoid of the arrogant cruelty she had wielded against me just hours prior at the port. "I am not going to fix anything, Yvette," I said, my voice deliberately flat and cold. "I told you at the terminal, I am not an automated teller machine for strangers. You wanted a trip with just family. I am respecting your wishes." Before my mother could formulate a response, the screen jerked violently. My father Jerome snatched the phone from her hands. His broad face filled the frame, his jaw clenched tight. He tried to use his booming, authoritative baritone, the exact voice he used to command obedience from his congregation and fear from his children. "You will not disrespect us in public." Camille Jerome ordered, his eyes narrowing. "You do not get to dictate how this family operates just because you have some money. Unfreeze that account right this second. Trevor is trying to entertain vital investors on this ship. You are jeopardizing his career and the future of this family because of a petty temper tantrum. I let out a full, resonant laugh that echoed off the glass walls of my office. It was a genuine laugh born from years of suppressing the sheer absurdity of my family's social climbing delusions. Dad, I want you to listen to yourself very carefully, I said, leaning closer to the camera. You are standing in the middle of the Caribbean Sea, begging your aggressive, unwanted daughter to pay for your white son-in-law's networking event. Trevor is a 32-year-old marketing executive who makes $60,000 a year at a boutique firm. Why on earth does he need a black woman's corporate credit card to buy martinis for his wealthy white investors? Jerome opened his mouth to shout, but I cut him off, my voice slicing through his authority. I thought Trevor was the provider. I continued, my tone sharp and unforgiving. I thought he was the golden ticket that elevated our family status. I thought having him around was the ultimate symbol of your success. Turn the camera around, Dad. Let me see the great provider. Let me see the man who is supposed to be leading this family, begging the bartender to run the card one more time. If Trevor is the brilliant business mind you claim he is, tell him to use his own limitless funds. The phone violently jerked again. Jasmine had ripped it from our father's grip. Her face was contorted with absolute fury. The humid ocean air was already ruining her silk press, but it was the panic in her eyes that gave her away. She pointed a manicured finger at the camera. You are just a bitter, lonely woman. Jasmine shrieked, her voice shrill enough to make the casino patrons at the neighboring blackjack table turn and stare. You have always been jealous of me. You are furious because I got the ring, the husband, and the life you cannot code into existence. You have all that money in the bank and a cold, empty bed every single night. You are just trying to ruin my marriage because nobody wants to marry you. I stared at my younger sister. For years, I had allowed her to weaponize her lighter skin, her loose curls, and her proximity to the traditional beauty standards my parents worshipped. I had allowed her to believe that her worth was inherently higher than mine simply because she played the submissive, delicate role my father demanded. But out here in the real world, the world governed by capital and ownership, her delusions meant absolutely nothing. Jasmine. I am not jealous of your marriage, I replied, keeping my gaze locked perfectly on hers. I am the sole sponsor of it. Every date night you take, every grocery run you make, every utility bill at the Oakwood Drive estate is paid through my checking account. You are 29 years old, playing house on my dime. You thought your light skin and that shiny white husband made you superior to me. You thought because Mom praised your beauty and Dad praised your obedience that you were the successful one. But the real world does not run on Mom's compliments. Jasmine's mouth opened and closed, her face draining of color as the truth stripped away her defenses in front of the entire casino. You wanted just family on this trip, I stated, delivering the final blow. So I am letting you handle your family business. Have Trevor pick up the tab. Enjoy the buffet. I reached forward and ended the call. I did not pause to revel in the silence. I immediately opened my phone settings, selected the contacts for my father, my mother, and my sister, and blocked their numbers permanently. I set the phone face down on the desk. The silence in my office was absolute, unbroken, and glorious. The heavy glass door of my office swung open. Tara, my closest friend, and the most ruthless commercial real estate broker in the state of Georgia, marched into the room. She was wearing a tailored crimson suit, holding a thick stack of legal documents against her chest. She dropped the paperwork onto my desk with a heavy, satisfying thud. Well, that sounded biblical, Tara said, pulling out a chair and sitting across from me. I could hear you projecting your voice all the way down the hall. I take it the cruise is not going well for the Golden family. Their onboard credit has been permanently revoked, I replied, picking up a silver pen from my desk organizer. They are currently stranded in international waters with a declined card and a bruised ego. Now tell me about the house. Did you secure the buyer? Tara leaned forward, her professional demeanor taking over. She tapped the top of the document stack. I did. I found a massive corporate investment firm that buys luxury suburban homes for premium corporate rentals. They do not care about the housing market fluctuations, and they do not care about waiting for standard mortgage approvals. They are willing to wire $500,000 in pure cash directly into the Aegis Holdings corporate account by tomorrow morning. I nodded, feeling the momentum of the plan accelerating. That is exactly what we need. Where do I sign? Tara placed her hand flat over the signature line, stopping me. Hold on, Camille. There is a catch. A very big catch. I looked up at her, my eyes narrowing. What kind of catch? Because we are bypassing the standard 30-day closing period, skipping the formal staging and demanding cash in hand. Within 24 hours, the buyers hold all the leverage on the physical transfer, Tara explained, her voice dropping into a serious register. They are willing to overlook a lot, but their primary condition is non-negotiable. They want the property completely empty. No furniture, no personal belongings, no family heirlooms. It must be broom-swept and vacant. I processed the information quickly. When do they want it empty? Tara took a deep breath. 48 hours. If there is a single piece of trash left in that house by Wednesday morning, the deal dies, they pull the funds, and we have to start over on the open market. Emptying a 4,000 square foot luxury estate in 2 days was a logistical nightmare. It meant packing up 30 years of my parents' lives. It meant clearing out the master suite, the guest rooms, the formal dining room, and the massive garage filled with my father's tools and Trevor's discarded hobby equipment. It was an overwhelming, monumental task that would break most people. But I was not most people. I was a CEO who thrived on crisis management. I viewed my family's entire life accumulation not as a sentimental tragedy, but as a simple office logistics problem that needed to be solved. I looked at Tara, my expression completely unbothered. Hire a commercial eviction crew, I instructed, pulling the paperwork out from under her hand. Find a cheap, non-climate-controlled storage unit on the outskirts of the city. I want a team of 20 men at the Oakwood property by 6 o'clock tomorrow morning. Tell them to bring crowbars, heavy-duty boxes, and industrial trash bags. We are going to pack up their entire existence and put it in a concrete box. Tara grinned a sharp, predatory smile that matched my own energy. She handed me the contract. I will have the crew secured in 10 minutes. Sign the papers, Camille. I pressed the silver pen to the contract and signed my name. The house was sold. The purge was officially in motion. The diesel engine of a massive commercial moving truck roared through the manicured silence of Oakwood Drive at 6 o'clock the next morning. I stood on the driveway holding a thermos of black coffee, watching a crew of 20 burly men in matching gray uniforms spill out of the cab. This was not a delicate residential moving company that wrapped your grandmother's fine china in velvet and asked where you wanted the throw pillows placed. This was a corporate liquidation crew. I paid double for speed and absolute zero sentimentality. The foreman, a massive guy named Briggs, holding a metal clipboard, walked up to me. I unlocked the front door and pushed it open, revealing the grand foyer with its sweeping staircase and imported marble floors. I told him I wanted the entire property broom swept in 36 hours. Everything goes into industrial boxes. Load it up, drive it to the cheap storage facility on 5th Avenue, and lock it in Unit 402. No climate control, no special handling. Briggs nodded, blew a sharp blast on a silver whistle, and the invasion began. It was a beautiful, chaotic symphony. I stood in the center of the living room watching my parents' meticulously curated life dismantled piece by piece. Yvette's imported Italian vases were shoved roughly into brown cardboard. Jerome's massive mahogany desk, the very desk he sat behind to lecture me about my lack of traditional family values, and my aggressive masculine energy, was tipped onto a dolly and rolled right out the front door. 10 minutes into the purge, the aggressive screech of golf cart tires interrupted the rumble of the moving trucks. Mrs. Gable, the Neighborhood Homeowners Association president, marched up my driveway. She was a woman who made an absolute sport out of policing the black families in this affluent subdivision, a sport my parents eagerly participated in to prove they were one of the good ones. They constantly bragged to her about Trevor using his whiteness as a shield while hiding the fact that I actually footed the bill for the neighborhood fees. She marched right past Briggs and shoved her manicured finger in my face. She demanded to know what on earth I was doing, destroying Jerome and Yvette's property. She threatened to call the police immediately, claiming my parents were on a luxury cruise, and I was clearly a disgruntled relative, robbing them blind while they were out of the country. I took a slow sip of my coffee. I reached into my leather tote bag and pulled out the certified, notarized copy of the deed. I shoved the document directly into her line of sight, forcing her to read the bold print. I told her Jerome and Yvette do not own this property. Aegis Holdings owns this property. I am the chief executive officer of Aegis Holdings. My corporate tenants failed to secure a long-term lease and the asset has been liquidated. You can call the police, Mrs. Gable, but when they arrive, I will have them cite you for trespassing on an active commercial work site. She stared at the deed, the color completely draining from her face as the illusion my parents had sold her evaporated into the humid morning air. My parents had spent 3 years bragging at association meetings about their massive estate, letting everyone in the zip code assume their lifelong hard work paid for it. Now the neighborhood gossip mill would know they were just glorified squatters living on their dark-skinned daughter's charity. She spun around and drove her golf cart away in a furious, humiliated hurry. I walked upstairs to the second floor, bypassing my old childhood room, which Yvette had converted into a storage closet for her designer shoes, the exact week I moved out. I headed straight down the hall for the primary guest suite. This was Trevor and Jasmine's permanent sanctuary. My father had given them the largest suite in the house, claiming Jasmine needed the massive square footage for her influencer brand packages, and Trevor needed a quiet, expansive environment to brainstorm his brilliant marketing strategies. I pushed the door open. The room smelled of expensive cologne, entitlement, and lazy privilege. Briggs and 3 of his men were already tearing down the custom California king bed frame. I watched as they hauled the heavy mattress away, exposing the thick, plush carpet underneath. One of the movers stumbled backwards, his heavy work boot catching on a strange, rigid bump hidden beneath the rug near the walk-in closet. Briggs frowned and pulled the carpet back, ripping it straight off the wooden tack strips with a loud tearing sound. Buried in the subfloor, bolted directly into the concrete foundation of the house, was a heavy-duty steel floor safe. I stared at the dark gray metal, my mind racing. I bought this house. I approved every single blueprint and every structural renovation before I handed my parents the keys. I did not install a floor safe in the guest suite. That meant Trevor did. The man who refused to pay me a dime in rent because it emasculated him had secretly altered the foundation of my property to hide his own private business. Briggs looked at me, wiping sweat from his forehead with the back of his arm, asking if I had the combination. I told him I did not, but since it was bolted into the foundation of a house, I was legally contracted to deliver completely empty by tomorrow afternoon. It had to be removed or opened immediately. I told him to pry it open. Briggs grinned. He called out to his crew in the hallway, and 2 men rushed into the suite, carrying massive steel crowbars and a heavy sledgehammer. For 20 minutes, the sound of brutal force violently clashing against solid metal echoed through the empty hallways of the estate. They hammered the crowbars into the seam of the heavy steel door, using their combined body weight to force the locking mechanism. Trevor thought he was so incredibly smart, hiding his secrets in a house he paid exactly $0 to live in, completely shielded by my father's blind devotion. With one final deafening crack, the internal steel hinges gave way. The heavy door groaned, the locking bolts snapped, and the safe popped open. I waved the movers back and knelt on the dusty wooden subfloor. I expected to find Jasmine's excessive luxury jewelry collection, or maybe stacks of emergency cash Trevor hoarded away from his mediocre agency salary while I paid for his groceries. I reached inside the dark, cool cavity and pulled out a thick stack of heavy manila folders. The paper felt dense and official. I opened the first folder expecting bank statements, but my breath caught in my throat. There was no cash. There were no diamonds. The folder was packed to the brim with aggressive legal correspondence. I flipped through the pages, my eyes scanning the bold red letterheads from major financial institutions. They were notices of severe default. They were overdue payment warnings and threats of asset seizure. But they were not addressed to Trevor. They were addressed to my father. I grabbed the next folder and ripped it open. It contained a finalized second mortgage agreement on my parents' actual retirement property back in Springfield, the modest home they had worked their entire lives to pay off before demanding to move into my Atlanta house. I stared at the signature on the bottom line. It read Jerome Washington, but the handwriting was just slightly off. The pressure points on the ink were wrong, the slant of the letters too deliberate. I had seen my father's signature on 1,000 report cards and church bulletins. This was a masterfully executed forgery. I dug deeper into the safe, pulling out another stack of papers clipped together. Attached to the back of the fraudulent mortgage agreement was a direct wire transfer receipt. It showed $200,000 funneled straight from the unauthorized mortgage loan directly into a shell company registered to Trevor. The gravity of the betrayal hit me like a physical blow. Trevor had not just been living rent-free on the back of my black tax. He had been actively, systematically draining my father's retirement assets by forging Jerome's signature. He had played perfectly on my father's desperate desire to boast about his successful white son-in-law at the country club, using that toxic pedestal to gain access to all of Jerome's personal financial information. Trevor had bankrupted the very man who defended him at my expense. The diesel engine of a massive commercial moving truck roared through the manicured silence of Oakwood Drive at 6 o'clock the next morning. I stood on the driveway, holding a thermos of black coffee, watching a crew of 20 burly men in matching gray uniforms spill out of the cab. This was not a delicate residential moving company that wrapped fine china in velvet and asked where to place the throw pillows. This was a corporate liquidation crew. I had paid double for speed and absolute zero sentimentality. The foreman, a massive man named Briggs, holding a metal clipboard, walked up to me. I unlocked the front door and pushed it open, revealing the grand foyer with its sweeping staircase and imported marble floors. I instructed him that I wanted the entire property broom swept in 36 hours. Everything was to go into industrial boxes, be loaded up, driven to the cheap storage facility on Fifth Avenue, and locked in Unit 402. There would be no climate control and no special handling. Briggs nodded, blew a sharp blast on a silver whistle, and the invasion began. It was a beautiful, chaotic symphony. I stood in the center of the living room, watching my parents' meticulously curated life dismantled piece by piece. Yvette's imported Italian vases were shoved roughly into brown cardboard. Jerome's massive mahogany desk, the very desk he sat behind, to lecture me about my lack of traditional family values and my aggressive masculine energy, was tipped onto a dolly and rolled right out the front door. 10 minutes into the purge, the aggressive screech of golf cart tires interrupted the rumble of the moving trucks. Mrs. Gable, the Neighborhood Homeowners Association president, marched up my driveway. She was a woman who made an absolute sport out of policing the black families in this affluent subdivision, a sport my parents eagerly participated in to prove they were acceptable. They constantly bragged to her about Trevor using his whiteness as a shield while hiding the fact that I actually footed the bill for the neighborhood fees. She marched right past Briggs and shoved her manicured finger in my face. She demanded to know what on earth I was doing destroying Jerome and Yvette's property. She threatened to call the police immediately, claiming my parents were on a luxury cruise and I was clearly a disgruntled relative robbing them blind while they were out of the country. I took a slow sip of my coffee. I reached into my leather tote bag and pulled out the certified notarized copy of the deed. I shoved the document directly into her line of sight, forcing her to read the bold print. I told her Jerome and Yvette do not own this property. Aegis Holdings owns this property. I am the chief executive officer of Aegis Holdings. My corporate tenants failed to secure a long-term lease, and the asset has been liquidated. You can call the police, Mrs. Gable, but when they arrive, I will have them cite you for trespassing on an active commercial work site. She stared at the deed, the color completely draining from her face as the illusion my parents had sold her evaporated into the humid morning air. My parents had spent 3 years bragging at association meetings about their massive estate, letting everyone in this zip code assume their lifelong hard work paid for it. Now the neighborhood gossip mill would know they were just glorified squatters living on their dark-skinned daughter's charity. She spun around and drove her golf cart away in a furious, humiliated hurry. I walked upstairs to the second floor, bypassing my old childhood room, which Yvette had converted into a storage closet for her designer shoes the exact week I moved out. I headed straight down the hall for the master guest suite. This was Trevor and Jasmine's permanent sanctuary. My father had given them the largest suite in the house, claiming Jasmine needed the massive square footage for her influencer brand packages, and Trevor needed a quiet, expansive environment to brainstorm his brilliant marketing strategies. I pushed the door open. The room smelled of expensive cologne, entitlement, and lazy privilege. Briggs and 3 of his men were already tearing down the custom California king bed frame. I watched as they hauled the heavy mattress away, exposing the thick plush carpet underneath. One of the movers stumbled backwards, his heavy work boot catching on a strange, rigid bump hidden beneath the rug near the walk-in closet. Briggs frowned and pulled the carpet back, ripping it straight off the wooden tack strips with a loud tearing sound. Buried in the subfloor, bolted directly into the concrete foundation of the house, was a heavy-duty steel floor safe. I stared at the dark gray metal, my mind racing. I bought this house. I approved every single blueprint and every structural renovation before I handed my parents the keys. I did not install a floor safe in the guest suite. That meant Trevor did. The man who refused to pay me a dime in rent because it emasculated him had secretly altered the foundation of my property to hide his own private business. Desmond walked into the guest suite just as I was analyzing the lock. He had driven over from the office to finalize the transfer documents. He stopped dead in his tracks, his eyes darting from the safe to my face. Briggs looked at me, wiping sweat from his forehead with the back of his arm, asking if I had the combination. I told him I did not, but since it was bolted into the foundation of a house, I was legally contracted to deliver completely empty by tomorrow afternoon. It had to be removed or opened immediately. I told him to pry it open. Briggs grinned. He called out to his crew in the hallway, and 2 men rushed into the suite carrying massive steel crowbars and a heavy sledgehammer. For 20 minutes, the sound of brutal force violently clashing against solid metal echoed through the empty hallways of the estate. They hammered the crowbars into the seam of the heavy steel door, using their combined body weight to force the locking mechanism. Trevor thought he was so incredibly smart, hiding his secrets in a house he paid exactly $0 to live in, completely shielded by my father's blind devotion. With one final deafening crack, the internal steel hinges gave way. The heavy door groaned, the locking bolt snapped, and the safe popped open. I waved the movers back and knelt on the dusty wooden subfloor. I expected to find Jasmine's excessive luxury jewelry collection, or maybe stacks of emergency cash Trevor hoarded away from his mediocre agency salary while I paid for his groceries. I reached inside the dark, cool cavity and pulled out a thick stack of heavy manila folders. The paper felt dense and official. I opened the first folder expecting bank statements, but my breath caught in my throat. There was no cash. There were no diamonds. The folder was packed to the brim with aggressive legal correspondence. I flipped through the pages, my eyes scanning the bold red letterheads from major financial institutions. They were notices of severe default. They were overdue payment warnings and threats of asset seizure. But they were not addressed to Trevor. They were addressed to my father. I grabbed the next folder and ripped it open. It contained a finalized second mortgage agreement on my parents' actual retirement property back in Springfield, the modest home they had worked their entire lives to pay off before demanding to move into my Atlanta house. I stared at the signature on the bottom line. It read Jerome Washington. But the handwriting was just slightly off. The pressure points on the ink were wrong, the slant of the letters too deliberate. I had seen my father's signature on 1,000 report cards and church bulletins. This was a masterfully executed forgery. I handed the stack of heavily forged bank documents up to my attorney. Desmond adjusted his glasses, his eyes scanning the red default notices and the wire transfer receipts. Trevor drained him. I stated, my voice completely devoid of shock. It was just a cold, hard fact now. He did not just live here rent-free. He used my father's desperate need for white corporate validation to steal every dime Jerome ever saved. Desmond knelt beside the open steel safe, pulling out a secondary ledger bound in thick black leather. He flipped through the pages, his legal mind quickly assembling the pieces of the fraud. Look at the routing numbers, Camille. These wire transfers go directly from your father's primary retirement account into a shell corporation called Apex Synergy LLC. Trevor established this entity 3 years ago. I looked at the dates on the transfer receipts. 3 years ago. The exact timeline aligned perfectly. It was the same year my parents demanded I let Jasmine and Trevor move into the Oakwood Drive estate, so Trevor could focus on his supposed entrepreneurial ventures. He played him, I said, a bitter, humorless laugh escaping my chest. Trevor knew exactly what he was doing. My father spent his entire life trying to prove he belonged in the upper echelons of society. He wanted so badly to walk into the country club and boast about his brilliant son-in-law. Trevor weaponized that exact insecurity. Desmond pointed to a heavily notarized document at the bottom of the stack. It gets worse. This is a full unrestricted power of attorney. Your father signed over complete legal control of his Springfield property and his pension fund. The signature on the mortgage might be a forgery, but this power of attorney is absolutely genuine. Jerome handed Trevor the keys to his entire life. The memory hit me with the force of a physical blow. It was Thanksgiving dinner 2 years ago. We were sitting around the massive mahogany dining table downstairs, the one Briggs and his crew had just loaded onto a freight truck. Jerome had raised his crystal wine glass, silencing the room to announce his new business partnership with Trevor. He boasted that they were investing in a high-yield tech startup. I had asked to see the prospectus. I had offered to have my financial analysts at Aegis Holdings run a background check on the firm. Jerome had sneered at me in front of the entire family. He told me I was overstepping. He told me that just because I was a girl playing with code and running a little computer app, it did not mean I understood the complexities of aggressive male investing. Trevor had sat there swirling his wine, wearing that exact same smug smile he had at the cruise terminal, watching my father verbally degrade the only person in the room actually capable of protecting him. I warned him, I said, my voice turning into a sharp blade. I sat at that dinner table and warned him that giving his social security number and financial control to a man who could not even afford a mortgage was financial suicide. And Jerome looked me in the eye and told me to stay in a woman's place. Desmond shook his head, placing the documents carefully into his leather briefcase. Trevor bypassed all the standard banking alerts because he had the power of attorney on file. He took out the second mortgage on the Springfield house, funneled the cash into Apex Synergy, and systematically drained the retirement funds to cover his tracks and fund Jasmine's luxury lifestyle. Your sister's designer bags the luxury cars, the endless vacations. They were not paid for by Trevor's success. They were financed by your father's stolen retirement and your direct subsidy of this house. I stood up, brushing the drywall dust from my knees. The guest suite was entirely empty now. The bed, the dressers, the rugs. Everything was gone, leaving only bare walls and the gaping hole in the subfloor where Trevor had hidden his crimes. The sheer scale of the illusion was breathtaking. My parents had alienated their successful self-made daughter to worship a man who was actively robbing them blind. They had sacrificed my emotional well-being on the altar of Trevor's fake potential. What is the legal play here? I asked, looking out the large bay window. I could see the commercial moving trucks idling in the driveway, rapidly filling up with the physical remnants of my family's existence. You have no legal obligation to do anything, Desmond replied, standing up and adjusting his suit jacket. The fraud was committed against Jerome, not Aegis Holdings. If Jerome wants to pursue criminal charges when he realizes he is completely bankrupt, that is his prerogative. But given his immense pride, he will likely try to cover it up to save face. He will not be able to cover it up, I said, turning away from the window, because he is currently sitting on a luxury cruise ship with no access to my funds, and when he gets back, he will not have a house to live in. The reality is going to hit him all at once. We walked out of the empty guest suite and made our way down the grand staircase. The house echoed with our footsteps. The moving crew was incredibly efficient. The living room was stripped bare. The kitchen was completely cleared of Yvette's expensive appliances. Tara's deadline was 48 hours, but Briggs and his team were on track to have the property broom swept by sunset today. I felt a profound sense of closure. The heavy, suffocating weight of being the family scapegoat had been entirely lifted. I was no longer the disappointing daughter. I was the architect of their reckoning. I had severed the financial arteries that kept their toxic dynamic alive. Then my phone pinged. It was not a standard text message or a missed call notification. It was a high-priority red-flagged alert from the Aegis Holdings automated title defense system. My company used aggressive monitoring software to track the deeds and titles of all our corporate real estate assets, instantly flagging any unauthorized attempts to place liens or alter ownership status. I opened the secure application, my brow furrowing in confusion. Desmond saw the shift in my expression and stepped closer. "What is it?" he asked, his lawyer instincts instantly activating. I stared at the screen, my blood running ice cold. The alert detailed a sudden massive encumbrance placed on the Oakwood Drive property just 3 minutes ago. "Someone just filed a lien against this house," I said, my voice tight with disbelief. "That is impossible," Desmond countered, stepping up to look over my shoulder. "Aegis Holdings holds the deed free and clear. No bank would approve a lien without your direct corporate signature." "It is not a bank," I replied, my eyes scanning the digital filing details. "It is a predatory high-interest offshore lending firm, the kind that processes instant payday and title loans online without standard verification delays." I clicked on the applicant details. The name on the loan application burned brightly on the screen. Jerome Washington. "My father." Desmond swore under his breath. "He is desperate. You cut off his onboard credit and he is stranded on that ship surrounded by wealthy investors he is trying to impress. He needed immediate cash to keep up the charade. So he used the house." I realized the sheer audacity of his action washing over me. "He does not own this property, but he still has his original residential address listed here on his identification. He submitted a fraudulent application claiming he owns the estate free and clear to secure a massive instant cash loan. He used my house as collateral to buy drinks on a cruise." "Camille, the cash buyer," Desmond said, the urgency in his voice spiking. "Tara's investment firm demands a completely clean title. If there is an active pending lien on this property, even a fraudulent one, it halts the transfer process. They will not wire the $500,000 tomorrow morning. The deal will be completely dead." I looked around the empty, echoing foyer of the house I had paid for. My father had spent his entire life minimizing my achievements, and now, from the middle of the ocean, his desperate, pathetic ego was actively sabotaging a multi-million-dollar corporate sale. I gripped the phone tightly, my knuckles turning white. Jerome thought he had found a loophole to survive his vacation. He had no idea he had just committed federal wire fraud against my corporation. "Get in the car," I said to Desmond, my voice slicing through the heavy silence of the empty guest suite. We did not waste a single second. We left Briggs and his crew to finish tearing apart the last remnants of my parents' fake kingdom and sprinted down the grand staircase. My mind was racing, calculating the sheer, unadulterated audacity of my father. Jerome Washington, a man who preached integrity every Sunday morning, had just committed a federal crime from the buffet line of a luxury cruise ship. He had taken out a high-interest predatory title loan against a $500,000 estate he did not own simply because he could not stomach the embarrassment of a declined credit card in front of strangers. Desmond was already on his phone as I merged my car onto the highway, his fingers flying across the screen as he pulled the exact filing data from the automated title alert. "The lender is a place called Apex Fast Capital," Desmond said, reading the details. "They operate out of a commercial park near the perimeter. They specialize in instant approval bridge loans and emergency title collateral. They are notorious for bypassing standard 30-day underwriting periods by charging exorbitant, borderline illegal interest rates. They approve the cash file, the lien immediately to secure their position, and ask questions later." "They did not ask any questions at all," I replied, my grip tightening on the steering wheel until my knuckles turned white. If they had done even a basic 3-minute public records search, they would have seen that Jerome Washington's name is nowhere on that deed. Aegis Holdings owns it. They skipped corporate verification to lock in a predatory interest rate. That is exactly what we are going to use to bury them. Desmond stated his lawyer, instincts fully engaged. They gambled on speed, and they just placed a fraudulent encumbrance on a corporate asset. We are going to walk in there and threaten to burn their entire operation to the ground. I pushed the car well past the speed limit, weaving through the Atlanta traffic with cold, surgical precision. The clock was ticking. Tara had a cash buyer wiring $500,000 in the morning. If that lien was not dead and legally expunged from the county records, by the time the buyer's attorneys ran their final title check, the deal would collapse. I would be stuck with the house, and Jerome would have successfully used my own property to fund his delusion. 20 minutes later, I slammed the brakes and parked outside a low-slung, unremarkable concrete building in a fading commercial park. The sign above the glass door read Apex Fast Capital in cheap vinyl lettering. It did not look like a bank. It looked like a trap designed for desperate people. Desmond and I pushed through the front doors. The lobby was aggressively brightly lit, smelling of stale coffee and cheap carpet cleaner. A receptionist sat behind a raised counter, chewing gum and scrolling through her phone. "Can I help you?" she asked, not bothering to look up. "We need to see the branch manager immediately," I said, not slowing my stride as I approached her desk. "Do you have an appointment?" She sighed, finally glancing up. "He is currently reviewing files and cannot be disturbed." Desmond stepped forward, placing his leather briefcase flat on her counter. "Tell him the legal counsel for Aegis Holdings is here regarding a fraudulent title encumbrance filed exactly 42 minutes ago. Tell him if he does not come out of that office in 30 seconds, our next stop is the State Banking Commission." The receptionist froze, the gum snapping in her mouth. She frantically pushed a button on her desk phone and whispered into the receiver. Less than a minute later, a door in the back hallway opened, and a man in a poorly fitted suit walked out. He looked to be in his late 40s, sporting a slicked-back hairline and a permanent, arrogant smirk. "I am Marcus Vance, the regional director," he said, crossing his arms. "I do not appreciate people storming into my lobby making threats. What exactly is the problem here?" I did not wait for Desmond to introduce me. I closed the distance between us, my heels clicking sharply against the cheap linoleum. "The problem, Mr. Vance, is your complete lack of underwriting protocol," I said, looking him dead in the eye. 42 minutes ago, you approved a massive instant loan for a man named Jerome Washington. To secure that loan, you placed an emergency lien on a property located on Oakwood Drive. Marcus smirked, clearly accustomed to dealing with angry family members, contesting the financial mistakes of their relatives. "Listen, Lady Jerome Washington provided a valid state-issued driver's license with that exact address printed on it. He provided 2 recent utility bills in his name. That constitutes proof of residence and assumed ownership under our expedited lending guidelines. If you have a family dispute about his debts, take it up with him in civil court. The lien stays until the principal and the interest are paid in full." He signed the paperwork, the money has been wired, and the transaction is legally binding. He thought he had me cornered. He thought I was just a frustrated daughter who would ultimately write a check to clear my father's debt and save the family home. He had no idea who he was speaking to. I reached into my bag and pulled out the thick, notarized corporate deed for the Oakwood property. I slapped it directly onto the reception counter right under his nose. "A utility bill is not a deed, Marcus," I said, my voice dropping to a dangerously quiet volume. "Proof of residence simply means he sleeps there. It does not mean he owns the dirt beneath the foundation. Jerome Washington is a month-to-month tenant. This property is owned entirely by Aegis Holdings, a registered financial technology corporation. I am the CEO. You just approved a loan using collateral that belongs to a multi-million-dollar enterprise without securing a single corporate signature or running a basic title check." Marcus looked down at the deed. His arrogant smirk vanished instantly, replaced by a sudden sickening pale wash across his face. He realized his fatal error. Desmond stepped up right beside me, opening his briefcase and pulling out his own stack of legal letterheads. "Now that the corporate veil has been established, let us discuss your immediate liability," Desmond said, his voice ringing with absolute terrifying authority. By failing to verify the actual title owner, you have aided and abetted federal wire fraud. You have illegally encumbered a corporate asset, actively obstructing a pending $500,000 commercial real estate transaction scheduled for tomorrow morning. Marcus began to stammer, taking a step backward. Now hold on, we process hundreds of applications a day. The software automated the approval based on the identification match. We are protected under good faith lending statutes. You are protected by absolutely nothing, Desmond snapped, leaning over the counter. I am drafting a complaint to the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, the Georgia Attorney General, and the State Banking Commission as we speak. I will have your operating license suspended by Friday. Furthermore, Aegis Holdings will sue Apex Fast Capital for treble damages related to the interference of our commercial sale. We will bankrupt this entire branch, Marcus. Marcus looked at me, his eyes wide with genuine panic. The realization that he had walked into a legal slaughterhouse had completely broken his bravado. He raised his hands in a gesture of surrender. Okay, look, he stammered, sweat forming on his brow. If the deed proves corporate ownership, the automated lien is technically invalid. I can reverse it. I can kill the encumbrance right now. Do it, I commanded. And you are going to print me a physical notarized release of lien before I walk out of this building. Marcus practically sprinted back to his office. Desmond and I stood in the lobby, the silence returning to the room. The receptionist was staring at her computer screen, pretending she did not just witness her boss get legally eviscerated. 10 minutes later, Marcus emerged clutching a freshly printed, stamped and signed release of lien. His hands were physically shaking as he handed the document to Desmond. The encumbrance has been removed from the county digital registry, Marcus said, swallowing hard. The title is completely clear. The loan funds wired to Jerome Washington will be recalled through our fraud department. That sounds like a personal problem between you and Jerome, I said, turning away from him. Do not ever place a claim on my property again. Desmond and I walked out of the building and into the blinding afternoon sun. Desmond inspected the release document, verifying the stamp and the digital confirmation code. He pulled out his phone and sent a quick text to Tara. We are clean, Desmond said, letting out a long breath. The title is clear. The cash buyer's transfer will go through flawlessly tomorrow morning. Your father just tried to play his final hand and he missed the board completely. I got back into the driver's seat of my car, the adrenaline slowly draining from my system, leaving behind a deep, resolute calm. I had successfully defended my asset. I had neutralized the parasite that was Trevor, and I had blocked Jerome's desperate attempt to assert dominance from thousands of miles away. The Oakwood estate was currently being stripped down to the bare drywall. Tomorrow it would belong to someone else. I started the engine and checked my phone to ensure the navigation was set for my personal penthouse downtown. Before I could shift the car into gear, an alert popped up on my screen. It was a new voicemail. The caller ID displayed an absurdly long string of numbers indicating an international or satellite connection. I had blocked my parents and my sister, but I had not blocked Trevor. I had honestly forgotten he even had his own phone, considering how deeply embedded he was in my family's collective identity. I tapped the play icon, putting the audio on speaker so Desmond could hear it from the passenger seat. The sound of harsh static and wind filled the cabin of my car, followed by Trevor's voice. He sounded breathless, furious, and dripping with the kind of unchecked arrogance that only comes from someone who has never been held accountable a day in his life. Camille, this is Trevor, the voice demanded through the static. I had to pay $50 a minute to use the ship's emergency satellite phone because Yvette is currently having a panic attack in the stateroom. I do not know what kind of childish, vindictive game you think you are playing by freezing those accounts, but you have crossed a line you cannot uncross. I leaned my head back against the leather headrest, a slow, genuine smile spreading across my face. You embarrassed Jerome in front of important people. Trevor continued, his tone shifting into a reprimand as if he possessed the authority to scold me. You ruined Jasmine's vacation. You think this money makes you the boss of this family, but it does not. So listen to me very carefully. When we get back to Atlanta, do not even think about showing your face at Oakwood Drive. You are officially banned from the estate. Yvette is having the security codes changed the second we land, and Jerome is taking your keys. You are done, Camille. Stay away from our house. The voicemail clicked and ended, leaving the car in total silence. I looked at Desmond. Desmond looked at me. Trevor, the man who had secretly drained my father's pension, the man who lived off my charity, was officially banning me from a house that was currently being emptied into a concrete storage unit. He thought he was returning to a luxury estate to play the conquering patriarch. He had absolutely no idea that when their ship finally docked, they would be returning to a locked, vacant building owned by a corporate investment firm. I put the car in drive and pulled out of the parking lot, laughing the entire way home. The next morning, the Atlanta air was thick with humidity, but I felt incredibly light. At exactly 8 o'clock, I stood in the driveway of the Oakwood Drive estate. The commercial moving crew had been flawlessly efficient. The house, which 24 hours ago was bursting with the arrogant, unearned luxury of my parents and my sister's family, was now a cavernous, echoing shell. The walls were bare. The floors were swept. The heavy silence inside the 4,000-square-foot property felt like a deep, restorative breath. I walked through the grand foyer, my heels striking the marble floors with a sharp, commanding rhythm. At 8:15, a sleek silver sedan pulled into the driveway. The buyer's inspector, a sharp-featured man named Harrison representing the corporate investment firm, stepped out. He was accompanied by the firm's acquisition agent, a woman who carried a tablet and a permanent scowl. They did not care about the architecture or the natural light. They only cared about liability, structural integrity, and immediate rental viability. I greeted them at the door, handing the agent a fresh copy of the clean title verifying that Jerome's fraudulent lien had been officially eradicated from the county records. The agent nodded, satisfied, and instructed Harrison to begin the walkthrough. For the first 40 minutes, the inspection proceeded smoothly. The interior structure was flawless, a testament to the rigorous standards I had enforced when I originally purchased the property. We moved through the empty master suite, the stripped bare guest rooms, and the pristine bathrooms. But the momentum came to a violent screeching halt the moment we stepped through the sliding glass doors and onto the backyard patio. Harrison stopped dead in his tracks on the edge of the sprawling wooden pool deck. He did not step onto the planks. He knelt down, pulling a heavy-duty flashlight from his belt, and shined the beam directly underneath the primary support beams. He let out a low, disapproving whistle. "We have a massive problem," Harrison stated, standing up and turning to the acquisition agent. "The structural integrity of this entire deck is compromised. The primary load-bearing joists are not anchored to the foundation. They used interior grade screws instead of galvanized carriage bolts, and the wood is already showing signs of severe rot because it was never properly treated or sealed. If you put 10 people on this deck right now, it will collapse straight into the pool filter housing." The acquisition agent immediately tapped her tablet, pulling up the municipal records. "There are no permits filed for this construction," she said, her voice dropping to a glacial temperature. "This was an illegal modification. To bring this up to commercial rental code, we will have to demolish the entire structure, pour new concrete footings, and rebuild from scratch." She turned to me, her eyes locking onto mine with the ruthless calculation of a seasoned corporate predator. I respected her instantly, even as she delivered the ultimatum. "Miss Washington," she said, tapping her screen, "my firm is wiring $500,000 in cash today, but we are not assuming the liability for unpermitted hazardous construction. We will proceed with the closing, but we are instantly dropping our offer by $50,000 to cover the demolition and reconstruction. You sign the amendment right now, or we walk away, and you can try your luck on the open market with a condemned backyard." I stared at the sagging, structurally disastrous pool deck. A familiar, deep-seated anger flared in my chest, completely separate from the real estate transaction. That deck was Trevor. It was the physical manifestation of his arrogant incompetence and my father's desperate, toxic enabling. The memory of last summer hit me with vivid, irritating clarity. Trevor had decided he wanted to host a massive 4th of July barbecue to impress his former fraternity brothers and potential marketing clients. He announced at Sunday dinner that he was going to build a custom multi-tiered pool deck by himself. I had looked at the initial sketches he scribbled on a napkin and immediately saw the structural flaws. I offered to write a check that very night to hire a crew of licensed professional black contractors who had done immaculate work on my corporate headquarters. Jerome had absolutely erupted. He stood up from the dinner table, throwing his napkin down his face, twisted with genuine rage. He screamed at me in front of Jasmine and Yvette, his voice echoing off the high ceilings. He accused me of constantly trying to emasculate the men in our family with my arrogant corporate interference. He told me that Trevor was a capable, strong provider who knew exactly what he was doing, and that my insistence on hiring outside contractors was a direct insult to Trevor's manhood. He demanded I sit down, shut my mouth, and let a real man handle the property. So I had shut my mouth. I had stepped back and allowed the real man to take charge. And now, standing in the morning sun, the result of Trevor's unchecked ego and Jerome's blinding internalized racism was costing my corporation $50,000. Trevor had built a hazardous, illegal trap just to stroke his own vanity, completely protected by my father's refusal to accept reality. I looked back at the acquisition agent. I did not blink, and I did not panic. I was a CEO, and $50,000 was simply a line item in a negotiation. I accept the $50,000 reduction, I said, my voice steady and commanding. But in exchange for the immediate price drop, I am amending the fixture clause in the final sale contract. The house is sold entirely unfurnished, but I am legally excluding the luxury kitchen appliances from the transfer. They leave this property with me today. The agent looked on the pool deck, then at her tablet. She did not care about refrigerators. She cared about closing the asset. She nodded sharply. Agreed. Sign the amendment and I will authorize the wire transfer. I signed the digital contract right there on the patio. As Harrison and the agent walked around to the front of the property to finalize their paperwork, I pulled out my phone and made a highly specific phone call. I contacted a premium restaurant supply and luxury liquidator I had worked with during corporate event planning. I need a removal team at my property in 20 minutes, I told the liquidator. I have a custom imported Italian double oven gas stove and a matching commercial grade smart refrigerator. They have barely been used. Bring a truck and bring cash. That imported Italian stove was Yvette's most prized possession. I had purchased it for $12,000 as a Mother's Day gift. She did not even know how to cook on it. She treated it as a museum piece, a shiny trophy she polished and pointed out to every single guest who walked through the front door. She used it to assert her dominance over her country club friends, boasting about her exquisite, refined European taste. 30 minutes later, the liquidator's truck backed into the driveway. Two professionals walked into the kitchen, unhooked the gas lines, strapped Yvette's beloved Italian stove to a heavy-duty dolly, and wheeled her ultimate status symbol straight out the front door. The liquidator handed me a thick envelope containing $8,000 in crisp, untraceable cash. I shoved the envelope into my leather tote bag. The petty poetic justice of selling my mother's ego for pocket change to offset Trevor's incompetence was profoundly satisfying. By noon, the final digital signatures were processed. My phone chimed with the official notification from my corporate banking app. The $450,000 wire transfer had cleared. The funds were sitting securely in the Aegis Holdings account. The Oakwood Drive estate was officially sold, closed, and transferred. The acquisition agent shook my hand, turned to Harrison, and gave the final order. Harrison walked over to the front door, pulled a heavy drill from his toolkit, and completely removed the core cylinder of the front lock. Within 3 minutes, he had installed a heavy-duty commercial-grade smart lock. He keyed in a new security code, the deadbolt snapping into place with a loud final click. I stood on the sidewalk and looked at the house. It was no longer a weapon my family could use against me. It was just a brick-and-mortar asset belonging to a faceless corporation. The cord was permanently severed. I turned toward my car, breathing in the sweet, humid air, ready to drive back to my penthouse and completely erase them from my memory. Then my phone vibrated in my hand. I looked down at the screen. It was a text message from Jasmine. I had blocked her number the previous day, but she had apparently used Trevor's emergency satellite phone to bypass the block and send a direct SMS to my personal line. I opened the message. The words on the screen were dripping with absolute delusional entitlement. "We are landing early," the text read. Trevor secured an emergency flight and a private car service from the port. You have pushed us too far this time, Camille. Dad is bringing the police directly to your apartment tonight to teach you a lesson about financial abuse. You better be ready to face the consequences of what you have done. I stopped walking. I stared at the bright screen of my phone, reading the words a second time, just to ensure I was fully grasping the sheer staggering magnitude of their disconnect from reality. Jasmine honestly believed they were coming back to punish me. Jerome honestly believed he could summon the authorities to intimidate his daughter for freezing a credit card that belonged to her. They were flying home early, spending money they did not have to return to an estate they were permanently locked out of. And they were planning to bring the police to my doorstep, completely unaware that Trevor had forged loan documents, drained Jerome's retirement, and that my father had committed wire fraud to get a payday loan. They wanted to bring the law into this. They wanted a reckoning. I dropped my phone into my bag, a cold, dangerous smile spreading across my face. I opened my car door and slid into the driver's seat. "I will be ready," I whispered to the empty car. "I will be more than ready." The morning sun reflecting off the windshield of my sports car was blinding, but I barely blinked. I had been parked in the shade of a large oak tree directly across the street from the Oakwood Drive estate for nearly an hour. The neighborhood was quiet, waking up to a Tuesday that promised absolutely nothing out of the ordinary for the residents of this prestigious enclave. They had no idea that the house they passed every day had undergone a radical, violent transformation of ownership overnight. At exactly 9 o'clock, a sleek black SUV glided around the corner and slowed to a crawl in front of the driveway. It was the same vehicle my father had leased the week before they left for their trip. The windows were tinted, but I knew who was inside. I could see the silhouette of my father behind the wheel, his posture stiff with that familiar, self-important rigidity. Behind him, Jasmine and Trevor would be sitting in the back, probably still discussing how they would spend the remainder of the money Trevor had stolen from my father's retirement account. The vehicle turned into the driveway, rolling to a stop on the pristine paving stones. I lowered my sunglasses, my heart rate steady. This was the moment of impact. My father stepped out of the driver's side, looking refreshed and irritation-free from a week at sea. He was dressed in a crisp linen polo shirt, his face tanned. Yvette followed, burdened by an obscene number of designer shopping bags from the ship's boutique. Jasmine and Trevor emerged from the rear doors, looking like a caricature of wealth, oblivious to the fact that their world had been dismantled while they were sipping cocktails. I watched as Jerome marched up to the front door, his hand reaching into his pocket for the silver keyring I had given him as a token of my supposed submission. He pressed the key into the lock and turned it. Nothing happened. The tumblers did not click. The door did not budge. He jiggled the handle, his brow furrowing. He tried the key again, more aggressively this time, jamming it into the cylinder with a force that made the brass ring. Silence. The house remained shut, indifferent to his authority. Trevor walked up behind him, making a comment I could not hear, and reached out to grasp the handle. He pulled with both hands, rattling the frame of the front door. Suddenly, the silence of the neighborhood was shattered. A high-pitched, piercing siren erupted from the house, a sonic assault that was far more aggressive than the residential security system I had originally installed. It was a commercial-grade alarm, the kind designed to hold off looters, and it blared with a volume that forced the neighbors to start stepping out onto their porches. My father jumped back, shielding his ears, his face turning from confusion to a deep, apoplectic purple. Jasmine started shrieking, dropping her luggage on the driveway. Trevor looked around, his panic mounting as he realized he was being humiliated in front of the entire street. I opened my car door, stepped onto the pavement, and began walking across the street. The sound of the alarm was deafening, but it provided the perfect cover for the beginning of the end. I stopped at the edge of the driveway, my arms crossed, watching them struggle with the reality of their displacement. Jerome finally noticed me. His eyes bulged, and he pointed an accusatory finger toward me, his voice booming over the siren. "What have you done to the locks, Camille?" he roared, stepping down from the porch. "You will pay for this. You have no right to change the security on this house." I pulled D_12 from my blazer pocket, The final bill of sale that had been processed and stamped by the county recorder's office less than 24 hours ago. I held it out toward him, but I did not let him take it. "You do not seem to understand the status of this property, Jerome," I said, my voice cutting through the noise of the alarm. "You are currently trespassing on private corporate property. The Oakwood Drive estate is no longer a residence. It is an asset held by a commercial real estate firm." Trevor stepped forward, his face twisting into a sneer. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone, his thumb hovering over the screen. "You are insane, Camille. You have lost your mind. I am calling the police. I am going to have you removed from this property for harassment and illegal lockout." I stepped closer to him, my gaze never wavering. "Please do," I said, my tone deadly calm. "I have been expecting them. In fact, why don't you ask for Detective Rollins specifically? He is the lead investigator assigned to the fraud and forgery case involving the Apex Fast Capital loan. I believe he is very interested in speaking with you about the specific documents in E_12. The name hung in the air like a death sentence. Trevor's thumb stopped mid-air. The color drained from his face, and his smug arrogance flickered out, replaced by a raw, naked fear. He looked at the folder in my hand, then at the house, and then back to me, the realization dawning that he had not just been outmaneuvered, but outplayed. Jerome looked between us, his confusion growing. "What fraud? What loan, Trevor? What is she talking about?" I did not wait for Trevor to answer. I reached into my bag and produced the final document F_12, which outlined the criminal charges regarding the predatory mortgage Trevor had taken out in my father's name. "Trevor took out a high-interest title loan against this house using your signature, Dad," I said, looking at Jerome. "He used your identity to steal money to pay for Jasmine's lifestyle. And when he ran out of your retirement, he turned to my house. But you do not own this house, and neither does he. The law enforcement officers on their way here are not coming to help you move back in. They are coming to process the paper trail of your son-in-law's criminal career." Trevor tried to speak, his voice coming out in a garbled, frantic stutter. "That is a lie. That is a fabrication. Camille is just trying to sabotage us because she cannot handle her own unhappiness." I looked at the sirens approaching from the distance, the flashing lights reflecting off the windows of the empty house. The neighbors were now all out on their lawns, watching the unraveling of the Washington family's gilded reputation. The eviction was complete. The sale was finalized. The secrets were exhumed. I turned back to the family, who stood huddled on the driveway, the shopping bags from their trip lying in the grass around them, like discarded refuse. "You wanted to teach me a lesson about financial abuse," I said, watching the police cruisers pull to a stop behind the black SUV. "Well, congratulations. You are about to get a masterclass in it." The lead officer stepped out, followed by Detective Rollins. They did not approach me with handcuffs or questions about trespassing. They walked straight to Trevor, their hands resting on their holsters, their expressions grim and professional. Trevor looked at me, his eyes wide and pleading, the desperation in his gaze almost laughable. "Camille, tell them. Tell them this is just a misunderstanding." I looked him straight in the eye, the wind picking up around us, and felt the final tether snap. "I have nothing to say to you, Trevor," I replied, "except that you should have realized that a girl who plays with code can also engineer the destruction of everything you tried to build." As the officers moved in, Jerome finally collapsed onto the hood of his SUV, the full weight of the foreclosure, the bankruptcy, and the fraud crushing him under the weight of his own hubris. I turned and walked away toward my car. I did not look back. I had played the long game, and I had won. The house was sold. The parasites were being removed, and for the first time in 35 years, I was entirely, completely alone in the best possible way. I started my car, put it in reverse, and drove away, leaving them to the reality of the empty house and the cold, hard handcuffs of justice. My future, whatever it held, would be built on the truth I had finally laid bare. Two standard police cruisers swerved onto Oakwood Drive, their tires screeching against the asphalt as they boxed in Jerome's leased black SUV. An unmarked dark gray sedan pulled up directly behind them. The flashing red and blue lights illuminated the pristine manicured lawns of the affluent neighborhood, drawing even more curious residents out onto their front porches. The deafening wail of the sirens cut off as the vehicles shifted into park, leaving only the relentless ear-piercing shriek of the commercial security alarm I had installed on the front door. The heavy doors of the cruisers pushed open and 4 uniformed officers stepped out, their hands resting cautiously on their duty belts. Detective Rollins emerged from the unmarked sedan, his eyes instantly locking onto Trevor. Yvette did not waste a single millisecond. The moment the first officer stepped onto the driveway, she launched into a breathtaking masterclass of theatrical manipulation. She intentionally dropped her heavy duty-free shopping bags, letting expensive perfumes and imported silk scarves spill carelessly onto the concrete. She rushed toward the officers, clutching her chest, her face twisted into a mask of absolute terror and manufactured victimhood. "Officer, thank God you are here," Yvette cried, her voice trembling with perfectly calibrated panic. "You have to help us. We just returned from a family vacation and we are being terrorized. My daughter has completely lost her mind. She is mentally unstable, she is acting aggressive, and she has illegally locked us out of our own home. We are terrified of what she might do." Jerome immediately stepped up right beside her, puffing out his chest to assume the role of the protective patriarch. He pointed a rigid, furious finger directly at my face. "I want her arrested right now," Jerome demanded, his voice booming over the blaring security alarm. "This is a clear-cut case of elder abuse and illegal eviction. She is having some sort of psychotic break. She sabotaged the locks on my front door and is standing here threatening my family. Put her in handcuffs before she hurts someone." I did not flinch. I did not raise my voice to defend myself against their frantic accusations. I simply reached into my pocket, pulled out my smartphone, and opened the property management application. With a single deliberate tap on the screen, I deactivated the commercial alarm. The sudden heavy silence that fell over the driveway was absolute. The ringing in our ears faded, replaced only by the low idle of the police cruisers. The lead officer, a tall, seasoned man with graying hair at his temples, held up a gloved hand to stop Jerome from continuing his tirade. He looked at Yvette's fake tears, then at Jerome's aggressive posturing, and finally turned his gaze to me. I was leaning casually against the driver's side door of my sports car, holding my half-empty cup of coffee, looking thoroughly bored by the entire spectacle. "Let us take this down a notch," the lead officer said, his voice dropping to a calm, authoritative register. "Nobody is getting arrested until I understand exactly what is happening here. Sir, you claim this is your primary residence." "It is my house," Jerome snapped, reaching into his back pocket and pulling out his wallet. He yanked his state-issued driver's license from the leather sleeve and shoved it toward the officer. "My name is Jerome Washington. My legal address is printed right there on the front. I am the head of this household and I demand you remove this woman from my property." The officer took the license, inspecting the address carefully. He nodded slowly, handing the card back to Jerome. He then turned and took slow, measured steps across the asphalt until he was standing directly in front of me. "Ma'am," the officer said, his tone neutral. "He says this is his house. You have altered the security systems and are currently preventing them from entering. What exactly is your stake in this property?" I took a slow sip of my latte. I set the cup down on the roof of my car and unzipped my leather tote bag. I did not offer a tearful backstory. I did not explain how my parents had alienated me or how they worshipped the ground my white brother-in-law walked on. I dealt strictly in corporate facts. I pulled out a thick, heavy stack of documents bound by a black legal clip. On top was the certified notarized corporate deed. Directly beneath it was the final bill of sale bearing the digital timestamp, an official seal from the county recorder's office, finalized just hours ago. I handed the heavy stack of paperwork to the officer. "My name is Camille Washington," I stated, my voice projecting clearly across the quiet street so my parents could hear every single syllable. "I am the Chief Executive Officer of Aegis Holdings. That company owned this estate free and clear. I say owned past tense because as of noon today, the property was legally sold to a commercial investment firm. The people standing in that driveway were month-to-month corporate tenants who failed to secure a long-term lease. They do not own this house, they have never owned this house, and they currently have zero legal right to be standing on that pavement. The lead officer adjusted his stance, opening the heavy file. He spent 2 full minutes reading through the documents. He checked the corporate seals, the notary stamps, and the final transfer of deed. The contrast between Yvette's hysterical crying and my cold, undeniable paper trail was stark. The officer closed the folder, handing it back to me with a respectful nod. He turned around and walked back toward Jerome. My father was standing tall, a smug, expectant smirk playing on his lips, waiting for the officer to turn around and slap cuffs on my wrists. "Sir," the officer said, his voice completely stripped of any previous sympathy. "This property was legally sold by Aegis Holdings today. The title has been transferred. You have zero rights to this address. You need to gather your belongings and step off the driveway immediately, or I will cite you for trespassing." Jerome and Yvette hit a wall of pure, unadulterated shock. The color drained from my father's face so fast he looked physically ill. Yvette's fake tears instantly vanished, her mouth dropping open in a silent gasp. The illusion they had spent years meticulously building for their country club friends and the neighborhood association shattered into a million irreparable pieces right there on the concrete. "What do you mean, sold?" Jerome choked out, his voice, cracking the booming authority completely evaporating. "That is impossible. Where is all my furniture? Where are my imported rugs? Where is my life?" "You do not have a life here anymore, Jerome," I said, pushing off my car and stepping fully into the sunlight. "You spent 3 years bragging about a mansion you paid exactly $0 for. When you left for your luxury cruise, your corporate tenancy was officially terminated. Your furniture, your clothes, and your precious imported Italian vases were boxed up by a commercial liquidation crew yesterday morning." I reached into my pocket and pulled out a single cheap silver key with a bright yellow plastic tag attached to it. I tossed the key directly at Jerome's chest. It hit his linen shirt and clattered onto the driveway. "That is the key to Unit 402 at the discount storage facility on 5th Avenue. I stated, my eyes locking onto his. "There is no climate control. I paid for 30 days. After that, they auction off whatever you leave behind." Jasmine finally broke her silence, stepping forward with her fists clenched. "You spiteful, jealous failure," she screamed, pointing at me. "You are just doing this because you are miserable. You are trying to ruin us because Trevor is actually successful, and you cannot handle it." At the mention of Trevor's name, Detective Rollins, who had been standing silently near the back of the group, took a step forward. Trevor saw him move and immediately tried to step behind the bulk of the SUV, his breath coming in shallow, panicked gasps. "You think Trevor is successful, Jasmine?" I asked, a cold, humorless laugh escaping my chest. "You think those designer bags on the ground were paid for by his brilliant marketing agency?" I reached back into my tote bag and pulled out the heavy manila folder I had retrieved from the hidden steel floor safe in the guest suite yesterday morning. The folder was thick, packed tight with the undeniable evidence of a ruined life. I walked across the driveway, closing the distance until I was standing just inches away from my father. Jerome was shaking his eyes, darting frantically between me, the police officers, and the empty house. I did not just hand him the folder. I shoved it hard against his chest, forcing him to take it. "Open it," I commanded. Jerome's hands were trembling so badly he could barely peel back the metal clasp. He flipped the cover open. The bright red letterheads of severe financial default notices blared up at him in the morning light. I watched his eyes scan the documents. I watched the exact second his brain processed the finalized second mortgage agreement on his Springfield retirement property. I watched him see his own forged signature on the bottom line. I watched him flip to the next page and find the wire transfer receipts showing hundreds of thousands of dollars funneled directly from his pension accounts into Apex Synergy, LLC. "That is Trevor's shell company," I said, my voice dropping to a low, lethal whisper. "He did not just live here rent-free, Jerome. He used the unrestricted power of attorney you blindly handed him to systematically drain every single dime you saved your entire life. He forged your signature on a second mortgage. He bankrupted you while you sat at the head of the table and praised his business acumen. You defended him while he destroyed you. Jerome could not breathe. He clutched the folder, his knees visibly buckling as he stared at the red ink that spelled the end of his entire existence. He looked up, his eyes searching frantically for Trevor. Trevor was no longer looking arrogant. He was backed against the rear bumper of the SUV, sweating profusely, staring at Detective Rollins, who was now holding a pair of heavy steel handcuffs. Jerome stared at the papers. The heavy, humid Atlanta air seemed to stand entirely still, thick and suffocating. The dense manila folder trembled in his large, manicured hands. I watched his eyes dart back and forth across the bold, red typography of the financial default notices. He flipped past the first page, his breathing becoming shallow and erratic as he stared at the itemized bank statements. He was looking at the exact routing numbers that corresponded to Apex Synergy LLC. He was looking at the second mortgage taken out against his modest Springfield property. He was looking at the absolute, undeniable zero balance of his lifelong pension fund. The silence on the driveway was absolute, save for the low, steady hum of the idling police cruisers parked directly behind their rented SUV. The neighbors who had stepped onto their porches at the sound of the commercial alarm were now frozen, watching the gilded, pristine reputation of the Washington family dissolve into the hot asphalt. Jerome looked up. His eyes bypassed me entirely and locked onto Trevor. A guttural, primal sound ripped from my father's throat. It was not a word. It was the raw, violent sound of an ego being flayed alive. He dropped the folder, letting the heavily forged documents scatter across the driveway, and lunged at his golden son-in-law. Jerome's large hands clamped onto the collar of Trevor's expensive linen shirt, slamming the younger man backward against the side panel of the luxury SUV. Trevor let out a high-pitched yelp, his hands flying up defensively as Jerome pinned him against the polished black metal. "My pension!" Jerome roared, spit flying from his lips as he shook Trevor violently. "You stole my pension! You took my house!" Trevor stammered, his face turning an ashen gray, his feet scrambling for purchase on the concrete. "Jerome, wait! It is a misunderstanding." Trevor choked out, his voice cracking with pure cowardice. The market shifted. "I was going to pay it back. I just needed liquidity." The two uniformed officers immediately unclipped their radios, stepping forward to intervene, but before they could even cross the pavement, Yvette inserted herself into the violence. She did not grab Jerome to calm him down. She did not look down at the scattered bank documents blowing across the driveway. Instead, she threw her entire body weight between her husband and Trevor, violently shoving Jerome backward to protect the man who had just bankrupted them. "Leave him alone!" Yvette shrieked, positioning herself as a human shield in front of Trevor. She spun around, her face twisted into a mask of absolute hysterical denial. She completely ignored the police. She ignored the reality of the foreclosure notices resting by her designer shoes. She pointed a trembling, manicured finger directly at my face. "Do not touch him, Jerome!" Yvette screamed, her voice echoing down Oakwood Drive. "Can you not see what she is doing? She made these up. Camille fabricated every single one of these papers." I stood perfectly still, leaning against the side of my sports car, watching my mother unravel. "You have always been jealous," Yvette roared, the toxic, festering underbelly of our family dynamic, spilling out into the open street for every neighbor to witness. "You have always hated Jasmine. You hated that she was lighter than you. You hated that she had the good hair, that she was beautiful, and that she found a successful high-class white man who treats her like a queen. You could never get a man like Trevor, so you sit in your dark little office playing with computers, trying to destroy her happiness." Jasmine stood paralyzed by the open trunk of the SUV, clutching her duty-free shopping bags, nodding along with her mother's delusion. Yvette was breathing heavily, stepping right over the legitimate certified bank documents to close the distance between us. "You are sick, Camille. You printed these fake bank statements to frame him because your aggressive masculine energy cannot handle the fact that Jasmine is the prize of this family. Trevor would never steal from us. He comes from a good family. He has pedigree. You are just a bitter, lonely girl trying to ruin your betters." I looked down at the papers fluttering in the slight breeze. I looked at the lead officer, who was staring at my mother with a mixture of profound disgust and professional restraint. The documents are certified by the bank, Yvette. I stated, my voice cutting through her hysteria with cold surgical precision. The wire transfers correspond directly to the IP address of Trevor's personal laptop. He did not just steal the retirement fund. He used the power of attorney you blindly handed him to take out a second mortgage on the Springfield house. You are currently homeless, and your pedigree son-in-law is the reason why. While Yvette was violently rejecting reality and screaming obscenities at me, and while Jerome was leaning heavily against the hood of the car clutching his chest, Trevor calculated his odds. He saw the open door of the black SUV just a few feet away. The engine was off, but the keys were still in the ignition. With Yvette commanding the attention of the driveway, Trevor slowly, silently inched along the side of the vehicle, his hand reaching out for the chrome door handle. He thought he could slip into the driver's seat and simply drive away from the wreckage he had caused. He did not even make it 2 steps. Detective Rollins, who had been standing perfectly still near the rear bumper of the unmarked sedan, moved with terrifying, practiced speed. He stepped directly into Trevor's path, slamming the SUV door shut with a loud metallic thud that made Jasmine scream. Trevor jumped back, stammering quickly, raising his hands in a pathetic, trembling gesture of surrender. "Going somewhere, Mr. Blackwood?" Rollins asked, his voice dripping with absolute, unwavering contempt. Before Trevor could formulate a single lie, Rollins grabbed his wrist, spinning him around and slamming his chest hard against the tinted window of the SUV. The sharp, unmistakable ratcheting sound of heavy steel handcuffs echoed across the driveway as Rollins secured Trevor's wrists tightly behind his back. "Trevor Blackwood, you are being detained on suspicion of federal wire fraud, identity theft, and elder financial abuse," Rollins stated calmly, reading him his rights as he patted down Trevor's pockets. Jasmine dropped her shopping bags, letting out a blood-curdling wail. She rushed toward the detective, but the lead uniformed officer stepped in her path, holding up a stern hand to keep her back. Trevor whimpered, his face pressed against the glass, offering no resistance, as the detective marched him away from the luxury vehicle and shoved him into the cramped, hard plastic back seat of the police cruiser. Jerome stood frozen. He watched his ultimate status symbol, the man he had chosen to worship over his own daughter, being locked in the back of a squad car. The illusion was completely dead. The bankruptcy was a hard, undeniable fact. The public humiliation was absolute. But Jerome Washington was a man who would rather burn the entire world to ash than admit he was the architect of his own destruction. He slowly turned his head, his eyes locking onto mine. His chest heaved, his face a terrifying portrait of a man with absolutely nothing left to lose. The realization that I was standing there financially secure, completely unbothered, and entirely victorious snapped the final frayed thread of his sanity. He stepped toward me, ignoring the police officers, ignoring his screaming wife, and ignoring his sobbing golden child. "You think you have won?" Jerome snarled, his voice a low, venomous rumble that carried across the hot pavement. "You think you can humiliate me in front of the world and just walk away?" I did not break eye contact. I did not step back. "I know the name of your holding company now," Jerome continued, his eyes burning with a desperate, destructive rage. "I will call the board of directors of your little app company tomorrow morning. I will tell them their CEO is a fraud, a manipulator, and completely mentally unstable. I will burn your career to the ground, Camille." The morning sun cut blindingly across the polished glass and steel of the Atlanta skyline. 50 stories above the chaotic crawl of the city, the executive suite of Aegis Holdings was a fortress of absolute silence. I stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows of my office, a steaming cup of black espresso in my hand, looking out over the sprawling metropolitan grid. The adrenaline of yesterday's confrontation in the driveway had entirely dissipated, leaving behind a cold, crystalline focus. Trevor was currently sitting in a holding cell, facing federal wire fraud charges. My parents were effectively homeless, and the Oakwood Drive estate was legally transferred to its new corporate owners. I took a slow sip of my coffee, savoring the tranquility. It lasted exactly 10 seconds. The heavy glass doors of my office swung open with a violent rush of air. Desmond strode in his usual immaculate composure, entirely shattered. His tie was slightly crooked, and he was gripping his secure tablet so tightly his knuckles were white. "We have a massive cascading problem," Desmond stated, dropping the tablet directly onto my glass desk. "The minority shareholders have convened an emergency unscheduled board meeting. It starts in exactly 4 minutes, and they are demanding a vote of no confidence to freeze your executive authority." I set my espresso down, my brow furrowing. Aegis Holdings was fiercely profitable. Our quarterly projections had just blown past industry standards. There was absolutely zero financial metric that would trigger a panic of this magnitude. "What is the catalyst?" I asked, pulling the tablet toward me and quickly scanning the chaotic influx of encrypted emails and frantic stakeholder messages. "It is your father," Desmond said, his voice dropping an octave as he delivered the blow. Jerome actually followed through on his threat. He spent the entire night and early morning systematically calling every single high-net-worth investor in his country club network. "He has deep ties with our initial angel investors. He told them you suffered a severe violent psychotic break yesterday afternoon." I stared at Desmond, the sheer, unadulterated audacity of the lie washing over me. "He told them you aggressively locked your elderly parents out of their home during a manic episode." Desmond continued, pacing the length of my office. "He claimed you had Trevor arrested on fabricated charges because of your failing mental state, and that you are currently funneling corporate assets to fund a personal vendetta. He warned them that the SEC is preparing to raid Aegis Holdings, and he strongly advised every single one of his associates to initiate a mass withdrawal from the fintech platform before the market opens." My father had weaponized his age, his gender, and his counterfeit country club pedigree to orchestrate a run on my company. He knew exactly how to play the old guard. He knew that older conservative male investors were perpetually terrified of emotional instability in female founders. He had tapped into their deepest, most archaic prejudices, painting me as a hysterical woman burning through their capital. The intercom on my desk buzzed sharply. "Miss Washington," my executive assistant said, her voice tight with panic. "The minority shareholders are all currently waiting on the secure video conference line in the main boardroom. They are extremely agitated. And there is a situation down in the main lobby. Your father just bypassed the security desk. He is demanding access to the elevators, claiming he is here on emergency family business." "Send him up," I commanded without a second of hesitation. "Send him directly into the boardroom." Desmond stopped pacing, staring at me as if I had lost my mind. "Camille, you cannot let him in there. He is actively trying to detonate your valuation." "Let him in," I repeated, walking around my desk and smoothing out the front of my tailored blazer. "Jerome wants an audience. He wants to play the conquering hero. I am going to give him the biggest stage he has ever had." Desmond and I walked out of my office and down the long carpeted corridor toward the executive boardroom. The room was expansive, dominated by a massive marble table and a wall-sized digital projection screen currently displaying a grid of 8 very wealthy, very panicked men. They were shouting over one another, demanding answers about frozen assets and SEC raids. Before I could even take my seat at the head of the table, the heavy double doors of the boardroom burst open. Jerome Washington marched into the room. He was wearing a dark, impeccably tailored suit, projecting the absolute image of a seasoned, steady corporate patriarch. He did not look like a man whose retirement had just been stolen by his favorite son-in-law. He looked like a savior. He walked right past me, completely ignoring my presence, and positioned himself directly in front of the camera array to address the shareholders. "Gentlemen," Jerome announced, raising his hands in a gesture of deep, sorrowful paternal duty. "I apologize for the disruption, but I am stepping in to oversee the immediate transition of power." The shouting on the video conference immediately ceased. The men on the screen leaned forward, recognizing Jerome from the golf courses and the charity galas. "It breaks my heart to stand before you today," Jerome continued, perfectly modulating his voice to convey tragedy and strength. "My daughter Camille is a brilliant girl. She worked incredibly hard to build this platform, but the pressure of the executive lifestyle has completely broken her. She suffered a severe mental collapse yesterday. She evicted her own mother and me onto the street. She initiated false legal proceedings against family members, and she is no longer capable of rational fiduciary logic. I stood silently near the mahogany credenza, watching my father execute the most flawless, vicious character assassination of my entire life. I am currently working with my legal counsel to establish an emergency conservatorship. Jerome told the investors, leaning his hands flat on the marble table. But in the interim, I cannot allow her emotional instability to destroy your investments. I am stepping in as a proxy. I will be bringing in my brother, a man with 40 years of corporate banking experience, to stabilize this firm, freeze the outward flow of capital, and secure your assets. He actually believed it. He genuinely believed that because he had caused a panic, he could simply swoop in, point to my gender and a fabricated mental illness, and commandeer my success. He thought he could steal my company and hand it over to a male relative just to prove he was still the patriarch. Jerome turned to me, a sickening, triumphant smirk playing on his lips. He looked at me with the exact same condescension he had used when I was a child. "Sit down," Camille Jerome said softly. "The adults are handling this now." I did not sit down. I walked slowly to the head of the table, pulling a sleek silver remote from my blazer pocket. I pressed a single button. The overhead lights in the boardroom instantly dimmed, and the massive projection screen behind Jerome shifted from the grid of faces to the live internal financial dashboard of Aegis Holdings. "Jerome, you have always had a flair for the dramatic," I said, my voice echoing through the quiet room. "But you have always been absolutely terrible at math." I pressed another button, and the financial metrics expanded across the entire wall. "You told these men that I was suffering a breakdown." I continued, pacing slowly behind him. "You told them to initiate a mass withdrawal from the platform, but you failed to understand that the minority shareholders on this call only control 15% of my voting stock. And while you were busy spreading desperate sexist rumors at the country club last night, I was busy closing the largest deal in this company's history." The screen flashed bright green. A massive, undeniable numeric value appeared in bold text across the dashboard. "Gentlemen," I said, looking directly into the camera array, "there is no SEC raid. There is no mass withdrawal. There is, however, a fully executed binding acquisition contract. I just secured a $50 million buyout from the largest national banking syndicate in the country." The silence in the boardroom was so profound it felt like a vacuum. The men on the video screen stared at the figures, their eyes wide, rapidly doing the mental math. "The shares my father just aggressively tried to convince you to abandon, the shares he tried to tank to stroke his own shattered ego, are now officially worth 10 times their value as of 6 o'clock this morning," I stated, the absolute finality of my victory ringing off the glass walls. Jerome slowly turned around to look at the screen. The color completely drained from his face, leaving him looking hollow and ancient. His jaw dropped slightly as his eyes traced the $50 million figure. He had marched into my office to steal my company, only to discover I had just catapulted into an echelon of wealth he could not even begin to comprehend. I walked right up to him, my voice dropping to a cold, lethal whisper that only he could hear. "Trevor bankrupted you," I said, staring into his terrified eyes. "But you just humiliated yourself. Get out of my building." I left the Aegis Holdings building with the crisp, untouchable calm of a woman who had just altered the trajectory of her entire life. The $50 million acquisition was secure. Jerome was banished. Trevor was in federal custody. The drive back to my luxury high-rise apartment building, the Azure, should have been a victory lap. Instead, the moment the revolving glass doors closed behind me in the grand marble-floored lobby, I found my path to the private elevators completely blocked. My father had wasted absolutely no time. Having failed to steal my company, he had resorted to his secondary weapon of choice, the extended family. Standing shoulder to shoulder, forming a physical barricade of righteous indignation, were Aunt Beatrice, Aunt Clara, Aunt Maxine, Uncle Marcus, and Uncle Leon. They were dressed in their Sunday best on a Tuesday afternoon, armed with heavy cologne, oversized designer handbags, and centuries of weaponized generational guilt. The building concierge stood behind his desk holding a phone, looking utterly terrified as he tried to decide whether to call security or let the domestic dispute play out. I gave him a subtle dismissive wave of my hand, signaling that I would handle it. Camille Washington. Uncle Marcus boomed, his deep voice echoing off the high vaulted ceiling. You have completely lost your mind. I stopped a few feet away from the mob, maintaining a perfectly relaxed posture. I did not cross my arms. I did not look defensive. I simply tilted my head, waiting for the inevitable onslaught. We just got off the phone with your father, Aunt Beatrice snapped, stepping forward and pointing a sharp manicured finger directly at my chest. He is having a heart episode in a hotel room right now because of what you did. You evicted your own parents. You put your mother on the street. You had your sister's husband thrown in a jail cell like a common criminal. What is wrong with you? I see Jerome gave you the highly edited, incredibly dramatic version of the morning's events, I replied calmly. Did he happen to mention that Trevor forged his signature and bankrupted his pension? Uncle Leon stepped up beside Beatrice, his face twisted into a scowl. That is family business, Camille. That is private business. You do not air dirty laundry to the police, and you certainly do not leave your elders homeless. You just made $50 million. Jerome told us everything about the buyout. You have more money than God now. You are going to turn around right this second, transfer funds, and buy your parents a new house. A bigger house. That is what successful Black children do. You take care of your elders. You pay your dues. You do not disrespect the people who gave you life just because you got a little taste of corporate wealth. The sheer audacity of the demand hung in the air. The concept of the black tax, the unspoken crushing expectation that the one successful person in the family must sacrifice their own stability, wealth, and sanity to fund the mistakes and failures of their relatives, was being wielded like a blunt instrument. They did not care that Trevor was a predator. They did not care that my parents had enabled my abuse for decades. They only cared that the money was available, and they believed it belonged to the collective. You are going to drop those charges against Trevor, Aunt Clara demanded, stepping into my personal space. You are tearing Jasmine's family apart. She is sitting in a hotel room crying her eyes out because of your petty, vindictive jealousy. Jealousy, I repeated, raising a single eyebrow. Do not play coy with us, Aunt Beatrice sneered, sizing me up with a look of pure concentrated disdain. We all know why you did this. You are 35 years old, Camille. You are aging, you are bitter, and you are entirely alone. You think $50 million makes you a woman. It does not. Money cannot keep you warm at night. Money is not going to give you children. You have focused so hard on acting like a man in the boardroom that you forgot how to be a woman. You look at Jasmine with her beautiful hair, her handsome husband, and her perfect life, and it eats you alive inside. You destroyed her husband because you can never get one of your own. Your bank account means absolutely nothing without a family to share it with. The three aunts nodded in aggressive unison, their faces masks of toxic superiority. They had spent their entire lives subscribing to a system where a woman's only tangible value was her proximity to a man. They were wielding my single status as a weapon, entirely blind to the fact that I was standing before them as an autonomous, self-made titan who had just orchestrated the downfall of the very man they were defending. I let the silence stretch. I let their cruel, archaic insults echo off the marble walls of the lobby until the sound completely died away. I did not raise my voice. I did not defend my femininity, my choices, or my relationship status. I did not owe these people a single explanation for the peace I had painstakingly built for myself. Instead, I unzipped my leather tote bag and pulled out my iPad Pro. You all speak so highly of family loyalty, I said, my voice smooth and perfectly composed. You demand that I buy Jerome and Yvette a new mansion. You demand that I respect my elders and protect the sacred bloodline. That is a very beautiful sentiment. It really is. I unlocked the tablet and tapped the screen a few times, navigating to an encrypted video file. Before my parents and Trevor set sail on their luxury cruise, I booked them a private VIP departure lounge at the Miami Port Terminal, I explained, holding the tablet in my hands. It was a corporate courtesy, Because it is a high-security port facility, the VIP lounges are equipped with comprehensive audio and visual recording to protect high-net-worth clients. As the account holder who paid for the suite, I receive a copy of the security logs upon the completion of the booking. I was reviewing the footage this morning to finalize my expense reports. I flipped the iPad around so the bright high-definition screen was facing the barricade of aunts and uncles. I pressed play. I turned the volume all the way up. The video showed Jerome, Yvette, Trevor, and Jasmine sitting on plush white leather sofas in a private sunlit lounge overlooking the Miami harbor. They were drinking champagne, laughing, and looking incredibly relaxed. The crisp, clear audio of my father's voice filled the lobby of my apartment building. Thank God we are finally getting away from Marcus and his constant, pathetic begging. Jerome's voice boomed from the iPad speakers. If he asks me to invest in one more of his failed ghetto business schemes, I am going to lose my mind. The blood instantly drained from Uncle Marcus's face. He physically recoiled, his mouth dropping open. The video continued. Yvette leaned into the frame, laughing as she touched Trevor's arm. You are a blessing. Trevor, Yvette's voice chimed in, dripping with elitist venom. You have elevated this family. If I have to sit through one more Thanksgiving looking at Beatrice's cheap wigs and listening to Clara complain about her credit card debt, I will scream. The rest of this family are just leeches. They are classless. They just sit around waiting for a handout. We are the only ones with any actual pedigree. Thank God Jasmine married you and got away from these embarrassing people. Trevor laughed on the video, taking a sip of his champagne. Do not worry, Yvette. We will keep the peasants at a distance. I tapped the screen, pausing the video right on Trevor's smug, laughing face. I lowered the iPad and looked at my extended family. The atmosphere in the lobby shifted from aggressive hostility to a volatile, explosive shockwave of pure rage. The aunts and uncles were paralyzed. The people they had just rushed across town to defend the elders they were demanding I buy a house for had been caught on crystal-clear, high-definition video, insulting their appearance, mocking their financial struggles, and calling them classless leeches to a white man who was actively stealing from them. The illusion of family loyalty disintegrated instantly. Aunt Beatrice's face turned a deep mottled shade of crimson. Her hands began to shake, her long acrylic nails digging into the leather of her handbag. Uncle Marcus let out a sharp, breathless curse, his eyes wide with fury and humiliation. They called me a leech. Aunt Clara whispered, her voice vibrating with rising hysteria. My own sister called me a leech to that criminal. I did not say a word. I did not need to. I simply stepped forward, moving smoothly through the gap that had naturally formed in their barricade as they turned to look at one another in horror. The unity of their ambush was entirely broken. They were no longer focused on my marital status, my bank account, or the supposed disrespect of my actions. They were entirely consumed by the ultimate betrayal of the family members they had sworn to protect. I walked past them and pressed the silver button for the private elevator. The door slid open with a soft melodic chime. As I stepped into the polished mahogany interior of the elevator, the shouting finally began. It did not start with me. Uncle Leon pulled out his phone, his thumb jabbing aggressively at the screen as he dialed Jerome's number. Aunt Beatrice began screaming about Yvette's sheer audacity, her voice shrill and completely unhinged. They were turning on each other with the ferocity of starved wolves. I turned around, facing the lobby as the elevator doors began to close. I watched my aunts and uncles completely self-destruct, entirely forgetting that I was even there. The toxicity they had tried to weaponize against me had been redirected right back to its source. I did not argue with them. I did not justify my life. I simply handed them the truth and let them choke on it. The elevator doors clicked shut, cutting off the sound of their screaming. The car began its smooth, silent ascent to the penthouse. I slipped the iPad back into my tote bag, taking a deep, cleansing breath. The corporate war was won. The family parasites were fighting among themselves. For the first time in my life, the silence that surrounded me felt absolutely perfectly earned. The echoing click of my heels against the concrete of the underground parking garage was the only sound cutting through the damp, subterranean air. I had just stepped off the private executive elevator of the Azure, my keys already in hand, aiming for my reserved parking space. The heavy steel security door locked behind me with a solid, definitive thud. I did not even make it halfway to my car before a figure stepped out from the shadows of a massive concrete pillar, intentionally blocking my path to the driver's side door. It was Jasmine. The golden child was completely unrecognizable. The immaculate, effortless glamour she had weaponized her entire life was entirely gone. Her expensive silk dress was deeply wrinkled. Her notoriously perfect hair was frizzy and unkempt, and her face was heavily stained with mascara from hours of violent, uninterrupted sobbing. She looked exactly like what she was, a woman whose entire fraudulent existence had been forcefully dismantled in a single morning. I stopped walking. I did not reach for my phone. I did not hit the panic button on my key fob. I simply stood my ground, my posture relaxed, waiting for the inevitable explosion. Jasmine practically threw herself across the asphalt, stopping just inches from my face. "You have to fix this!" Jasmine begged, her voice a raw, ragged shriek that bounced off the concrete walls. "You have to call the police and tell them you made a mistake. Trevor is sitting in a federal holding cell. They will not even let me see him. His bail hearing is tomorrow morning, and the lawyers are demanding a retainer I cannot pay. You have $50 million, Camille. You have to give me $100,000 right now." I looked at her, my expression completely void of any sympathy or familial warmth. The sheer breathtaking entitlement required to ambush the sister you had spent a lifetime mocking, only to demand a massive financial bailout for the man who just bankrupted your own parents, was staggering. "You want me to fund the legal defense of the man who systematically drained our father's retirement account?" I asked, my voice deadly calm. "He made a mistake." Jasmine screamed, her hands balling into fists at her sides. "He is a good man. He was just trying to secure our future. You owe me this, Camille. You ruined my life. You destroyed my marriage out of pure vindictive jealousy because you could never stand the fact that I was the favorite. You have always tried to punish me for being better than you." I did not raise my voice to match her hysteria. I simply pulled out the thick legal folder I was carrying, the one containing the exact documentation of Trevor's wire fraud. I held it up. "There is no jealousy here, Jasmine," I stated coldly. "There is only a paper trail. You are married to a predator. He used your proximity to Jerome to gain unrestricted access to his banking infrastructure. He did not love you. He saw you as an easy, gullible mark to secure his own financial liquidity." Jasmine slapped the folder out of my hand. The paper scattered across the dirty garage floor. "Do not you dare act like you are innocent in this." Jasmine roared, her face turning a mottled red. "You think you are a hero, but you just embarrassed us in front of the entire world." Mom knew what Trevor was doing. The silence that followed her outburst was heavy and absolute. I froze, my eyes locking onto hers. Jasmine instantly clamped a hand over her mouth, realizing the monumental, catastrophic weight of what she had just let slip. I stepped forward, invading her personal space, my voice dropping to a dangerous, lethal register. "What did you just say?" I demanded. Jasmine took a shaky step backward, her eyes darting frantically toward the exit ramp. "I did not mean it like that," she stammered, shaking her head. "It was a misunderstanding." "Tell me exactly what Yvette knew," I commanded, stepping forward again to trap her against the concrete pillar. Jasmine broke. The pressure of the day, the loss of her husband, and the terror of poverty completely shattered her remaining defenses. She leaned against the cold concrete and sobbed uncontrollably, the ugly, undeniable truth finally spilling out of her mouth. "Mom found the second mortgage paperwork in Trevor's briefcase 3 months ago." Jasmine cried, her voice echoing miserably in the empty garage. "She saw the wire transfers. She knew Trevor was siphoning the pension funds, but she told him to hide it. She told him to keep the accounts looking full until the cruise was over. She said the absolute worst thing that could happen to our family was the public shame of a failed criminal son-in-law. She said she could not walk into church on Sunday and face the congregation if they knew her perfect white son-in-law was a common thief. She covered it up to protect my image. She was going to wait until the end of the year to secretly force Trevor to pay it back. I stared at my sister, the profound, staggering sickness of my mother's logic washing over me. Yvette Washington had actively chosen to let her husband be financially gutted. She had chosen foreclosure, bankruptcy, and total destruction, rather than endure a single ounce of social embarrassment at her country club or her church. She had sacrificed Jerome entirely to protect the aesthetic of the golden child. I did not yell. I did not express outrage. I simply bent down, picked up the scattered papers from the floor, and placed them neatly back into the folder. "You will not get a single dime from me, Jasmine," I said, turning my back on her and walking toward my car. "You and Trevor deserve each other. You can both rot." I unlocked my car, ignoring her hysterical pleading screams echoing behind me. I sat in the driver's seat, pulled out my phone, and opened a secure message to my chief operating officer. "Time to drop the final anvil," I typed to Desmond. "Send me the address of the motel." Within 30 seconds, Desmond replied with the location of a cheap, run-down roadside motel on the absolute outskirts of the city limits. It was the only place Jerome and Yvette could afford with the cash they had in their wallets when the police escorted them off the Oakwood Drive estate. I started the engine, the powerful roar of the exhaust drowning out Jasmine's sobbing. I drove up the ramp and merged onto the highway, leaving the golden child to face the terrifying reality of her own choices. The motel was a depressing cinder-block structure surrounded by a cracked asphalt parking lot filled with weeds and flickering neon signs. It was the absolute antithesis of the luxury they had demanded their entire lives. I parked my car directly in front of room 112. The curtains were drawn tightly shut, but I could hear the muffled, aggressive shouting from the parking lot. I did not knock. I hammered my fist against the cheap wooden door. The shouting inside abruptly stopped. A moment later, the door swung open. Yvette stood in the doorway wearing the same clothes she had traveled in yesterday. The heavy humidity of the cramped room rolled out, smelling of stale cigarette smoke and desperation. Jerome was sitting on the edge of a sagging mattress behind her, his face buried in his hands. "Camille." Yvette snapped her posture instantly, stiffening into an aggressive, defensive stance. "What do you want now? Have you not done enough damage?" I did not wait for an invitation. I pushed past her, stepping directly into the center of the dingy room. Jerome looked up, his eyes bloodshot, his spirit utterly broken. "I just had a very enlightening conversation with Jasmine in my parking garage," I announced, ensuring my voice carried clearly across the small space. "She was begging for bail money for Trevor." In the middle of her tantrum, she revealed exactly how the second mortgage was authorized. Yvette's face turned an immediate sickening shade of pale. She lunged forward, trying to grab my arm. "Camille, stop it!" Yvette hissed, her eyes wide with panic. "Do not say another word." I easily sidestepped her grasping hands and looked directly at my father. "She knew Jerome," I stated loudly, watching the realization hit him. "Yvette found the forged documents in Trevor's briefcase 3 months ago. She found the bank transfers from your pension. She knew he was stealing your entire life savings, and she actively helped him cover it up because she was terrified her church friends would find out Jasmine married a criminal. She let you go bankrupt to protect her social standing." Jerome froze. He slowly stood up from the sagging mattress, his massive frame towering in the low-ceilinged room. He turned to look at his wife of nearly 40 years. The silence was deafening. It was not the angry, explosive silence of a standard argument. It was the hollow, terrifying silence of a man realizing his entire reality was a carefully orchestrated lie. "Tell me she is lying," Yvette Jerome whispered, his voice trembling with a terrifying fragility. "Tell me you did not know." Yvette backed away, her hands shaking. "Jerome, I was going to fix it," she cried, tears spilling down her cheeks. "I was going to make him pay it back. I just needed time. I could not let the neighborhood know we failed. I was protecting our reputation." Jerome let out a sound of pure agony. He grabbed the cheap motel lamp from the nightstand and hurled it against the wall. The glass shattered, plunging half the room into darkness. He screamed at her, his voice tearing through the thin drywall, unleashing decades of suppressed rage. The marriage imploded right there, dissolving into vicious, unforgivable accusations. I watched the destruction with total detachment. I had come to deliver the truth, and the truth was doing its job. Yvette, realizing she had completely lost her husband, suddenly spun around and directed her frantic, desperate energy at me. She marched forward, pointing a manicured finger at my chest. "You owe us," Camille, Yvette screamed, abandoning all logic in a desperate bid for survival. "I do not care what happened with Trevor. I am your mother. We raised you. We put a roof over your head. You just made $50 million. I am entitled to sweat equity for giving birth to you. That business is family money, and you are going to write us a check to fix this mess right now." I laughed. It was a cold, sharp sound that silenced her instantly. "You want sweat equity?" I asked, reaching into my bag. "You want a return on your maternal investment." Before I could pull out the documentation proving my complete financial independence, Jerome stepped forward. His face was a mask of cold, calculating desperation. He had lost his house, his pension, and his marriage, but he was still clinging to the absolute last shred of his patriarchal control. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a thick, legal envelope. "I do not need your charity," Camille, Jerome sneered, his voice dropping into a dark, threatening register. "I filed an emergency injunction this morning. I am suing you for 50% of your company. That LLC was seeded while you were living under my roof. By law, that constitutes family money. Your $50 million buyout is marital property of your parents, and I am going to bleed you dry in court." He shoved the legal envelope into my hands, officially serving me with papers right there in the motel room. He thought he had outsmarted me. He thought the legal system would automatically protect the patriarch. I looked down at the envelope. I did not panic. I simply nodded, turned around, and walked out of the motel room without saying a single word. The emergency court hearing was fast-tracked and scheduled for the very next afternoon. The courtroom was small, lined with dark oak panels, and smelling faintly of floor wax. I sat at the defendant's table wearing a sharp charcoal gray suit, my posture relaxed. Desmond sat right beside me, his briefcase resting on the table. Jerome sat at the plaintiff's table. He had hired a cheap, aggressive lawyer who looked like he had not slept in 3 days. Yvette sat in the gallery right behind them, weeping softly into a tissue, trying to generate sympathy from the judge. The judge, a stern-looking woman with gray hair tightly pulled back, banged her gavel to open the proceedings. "Mr. Washington," the judge said, looking down at the filings, "you are claiming that you are entitled to 50% of your daughter's corporate assets based on the assertion that her initial capital was derived from your household funds." "Yes, Your Honor." Jerome's lawyer stepped forward, adjusting his tie. "My client provided housing utilities and financial support during the foundational years of Aegis Holdings. Without his direct financial subsidy, the defendant would never have been able to launch her enterprise. We are demanding a freeze on the $50 million buyout pending a full forensic audit." The judge turned her gaze to my table. "Does the defense have a response?" Desmond stood up. He did not raise his voice. He simply opened his briefcase and pulled out 3 highly organized, heavily tabbed files. "Your Honor." Desmond began projecting a calm, lethal professionalism. "The plaintiff's entire case relies on the concept of financial dependence. We have provided the court with 3 specific exhibits to completely dismantle this fabrication." Desmond handed the first file to the bailiff, who passed it to the judge. "I direct Your Honor's attention to the file specifically labeled G_15, Desmond stated clearly. "That file contains 7 years of certified bank statements from my client's personal and corporate accounts. It proves unequivocally that Camille Washington paid for every single mortgage payment, every utility bill, and every property tax assessment for the Oakwood Drive estate from the moment she turned 22. Her father contributed $0 to the household. He was entirely dependent on her, not the other way around." Jerome shifted uncomfortably in his chair, his lawyer quickly flipping through his own copies of the documents. Desmond handed the second file to the bailiff. "Furthermore, I direct the court to the file named I_15, Desmond continued. "These are the finalized, notarized corporate formation documents for Aegis Holdings. The initial seed capital was generated entirely through a fiercely competitive venture capital grant awarded exclusively to minority women in technology. Mr. Washington's name signature and financial footprint appear nowhere in the corporate history. The judge reviewed the papers, her expression hardening as she looked over at Jerome's table. "Finally, Your Honor," Desmond said, handing the last heaviest folder to the bailiff. "The plaintiff claims a moral and financial superiority that demands compensation. I submit the file labeled K_15. This file contains the complete unredacted federal indictment against Trevor Blackwood, the plaintiff's son-in-law. It includes sworn statements and wire transfer logs, proving that while my client was building a $50 million empire, the plaintiff was willingly handing unrestricted financial power to a man who systematically bankrupted him. This lawsuit is nothing more than a frivolous, desperate attempt to extort a successful woman to cover the losses of his own monumental incompetence." The silence in the courtroom was absolute. The judge spent 10 excruciating minutes reading through the documents. She cross-referenced the bank statements with the corporate filings. She looked at the federal indictment. When she finally looked up, her face was a mask of pure judicial fury. "Mr. Washington," the judge said, her voice echoing sharply, "this is the most profound waste of the court's time I have seen in my entire career. You have filed a fraudulent claim to extort your own daughter because you mismanaged your retirement." She banged her gavel hard against the sounding block. "This case is dismissed with prejudice," the judge declared loudly. "Furthermore, given the documented harassment at her place of business and residence, I am granting a permanent ironclad restraining order, protecting Camille Washington, her corporate assets, and her associates from any contact by the plaintiffs. If you step within 500 feet of her, you will be arrested. We are adjourned." Jerome collapsed into his chair, his head dropping into his hands. His lawyer aggressively packed his briefcase and practically ran out of the room. The absolute final defeat was cemented into the public record. I stood up, buttoned my blazer, and walked out of the courtroom. The heavy wooden doors swung shut behind me. As I walked down the long marble hallway toward the exit, I heard the rapid, desperate clicking of heels behind me. It was Yvette. She had chased me out of the courtroom, her face streaked with tears, completely abandoning Jerome in her panic. "Camille, please," Yvette sobbed, grabbing my sleeve. "You have to help me. I have nothing. He is going to leave me. I am your mother. You cannot just abandon me. Please give me a second chance." I stopped walking. I turned around and looked at the woman who had spent 35 years actively participating in my emotional destruction. I felt absolutely no anger. I felt no sorrow. I felt nothing at all. "Dad wanted just family," I said, my voice quiet, steady, and completely devoid of any remaining attachment. "He wanted the perfect aesthetic. He wanted the golden child. Now you have exactly what you wanted. Enjoy it." I pulled my arm out of her grasp. I turned my back on her weeping figure and pushed through the heavy glass doors of the courthouse. The bright, warm afternoon sunlight hit my face. I walked down the concrete steps, unlocked my waiting car, and slipped into the driver's seat. I pulled out my phone, switched it permanently to airplane mode, and started the engine. I merged onto the highway, driving smoothly toward my $50 million future, surrounded by absolute unbroken peace. The most powerful lesson from Camille's journey is that true security and self-worth can never be inherited from a toxic family. They must be built independently. Often the people who are supposed to protect you are the ones who will exploit your loyalty to hide their own failures. When you stop seeking the approval of those who continually undervalue you, you strip them of their power. Success isn't just about financial independence, it's about having the courage to establish ironclad boundaries and walk away from manipulation. Your peace and your future are worth far more than maintaining a harmful family illusion. Have you ever had to set hard boundaries with toxic relatives to protect your peace and build your own success? Share your empowering story in the comments below and hit subscribe for more content on reclaiming your life.